Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this special meeting of the Water Commission on September 17, 2020. I will start the meeting by calling it to order. Commission Secretary, can you conduct the roll call, please?
Commissioner Young? I think your mic is
Muted, yeah.
I'm here.
Thank you. Commissioner Davis?
Here.
Vice Chair Kilborn? And Chair Keller?
Here.
And City Council Liaison Sneddon?
Here, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Mike Kilborn, or Vice Chair Kilborn just arrived. Vice Chair Kilborn?
Good morning, present.
Good morning, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Mr. Hagmark, are there any changes to the agenda?
Chair Keller, there are no changes to the agenda today.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we open it up for public comment? Or is there anyone that would like to make some comments before we get started?
Chair Keller, I don't see anyone wanting to make a public comment at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have two items on the consent calendar, the meeting minutes and the authorization of the first amendment to the Capita project member unit agreements. Would anyone like to discuss any points on those?
I'd make the motion to approve, noting that on item B, we're recommending approval of the resolution, just for the record.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis. Can I have a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you very much. Can we have the roll call?
Yes. Commissioner Young?
Yes.
Commissioner Davis?
Yes.
Vice Chair Kilborn?
Yes.
And Chair Keller?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So moving on to the administrative items, we have 5 of them today. First, we're going to hear on the advanced metering infrastructure project update. So please, Mr. Hagmark, Mr. Ward.
Good morning, Chair Keller and Water Commissioners. I'm Matt Ward. I'm the Water System Manager. As you're aware, city staff across departments have been working by committee with our consultant to develop an AMI project. And I'm pleased today to be here with Ms. Lancy, Acting Water Distribution Superintendent, and Ms. Hoffenberg, Water Resources Specialist, to present you an update on AMI. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Lancy.
Thank you, Mr. Ward, Chair Keller and Commissioners. We're very pleased to be here today to give you some updated information on what is happening with our AMI project. Next slide. Just an outline of what we're going to discuss today. We'd like to share with you how we feel that this project aligns with our department vision and what the long-term goals are for the project. We will give you some information about the pilot projects we've been conducting and share with you some of the lessons we've learned by doing these pilot projects. Then we'll also be talking about our timeline and our next step for overall system implementation. We will discuss what is happening with our request for proposals process and also update you on the status of the $1.5 million grant that we received. Next slide. So several years ago, the Public Works Department came together as a team to develop its mission, vision, and values. And the vision statement is shown here on the slide. And it is that we are a unified department that coordinates and collaborates effectively and earns the trust and high regard of our community. And we believe that this project supports that vision. The ability to collaborate more effectively with our customers by providing the more detailed water use information from an AMI system is key with our collaboration. We spend quite a bit of time working with customers on increased water use issues and trying to troubleshoot. And when you only have one data point per month to try to figure out what's going on, it becomes much more complicated. And this increased data will really allow us to have a better suite of skills in order to be able to collaborate with our customers on their water use. And with the trust and the high regard, it really having this data will also help us with helping the customers understand what's happening with their water, For example, we had a customer contact us concerned about the water meter, saying, I'm not here, I've turned off my irrigation, there should be no water use whatsoever. And we put a device on the meter that temporarily collects more detailed hourly data. And it turned out that a family member attending school in the area had been going to the property and using water. And so that really helped us with bridging a relationship with the customer to show that, yes, the meter is functioning accurately, and there are things happening with water use at your property. And it also highlights that this is a great opportunity for our customers that maybe don't live here all the time, and that they can still monitor what's happening with water use on their property. So the main goals of the overall AMI project is water conservation and really helping educate our customers and increase their literacy about their water use. Having this detailed data can really help them understand, when I make a choice about my water use, how it impacts how their overall bill and how their overall water use patterns are developed. And it also has a great opportunity to help us with optimizing how we utilize our water system. In particular, it will help us with looking at what some of our losses are and help us further develop our water loss auditing program. Next slide. We've been conducting a pilot program since early 2019. There are 400 meters involved in this pilot program, and it is giving us some real life hands-on experience, understanding what exactly our needs are. This AMI is very complex. It's not just putting a device onto a water meter that records usage. It's a whole system of hardware, of software, and we're going to be collecting much more data than we are now with only one water data point a month. And it's going to have some impact in our business practices. And as such, we felt that doing these pilot projects is going to give us as staff much better understanding of what our needs are. And so as we go into system-wide implementation, we now all have our own hands-on experience and examples of where the systems have been very, very useful and what the things are that we feel are our greatest needs. In addition, all of the pilot participants were invited to sign up for a customer engagement platform. And that allows us to survey those customers and find out from them what they find most useful so that we can ensure whatever we select is also meeting the needs of our community. Next slide. So what are some of the lessons that we've learned? One of the things that makes Santa Barbara so beautiful is our varied topography, but we've also found that it makes the communication rather complicated. On the far right, you can see a photo of the data collector that we installed up in the Riviera neighborhood. And we were surprised to find out that meters that had the devices installed all the way at the beach were able to communicate with this device very well. Whereas another meter that was only a quarter of a mile away, it was not able to communicate with it. So this graphic in the middle here kind of gives you an idea of what's happening. Line of sight is really key to the communication between the devices at the meters and the devices that are located throughout the service area to collect the data. And so when you have a hill or a slope, that the signal can kind of get lost as it's trying to go up the topography. And so it's not necessarily how close a meter is to the data collector, it's really what is the line of sight to that device. We've also learned that there are varied options as far as what these systems can provide to us as the utility, as far as the data, as far as usage on an inactive account or potential backflow conditions, reverse flow, varying levels of detail with potential leaks with customers, and also with the system status. There's a varying array of how much you can do troubleshooting with different communication issues right in the office versus having to go out in the field and check. So sometimes there can be a communication issue that's just sort of a temporary item, like a vehicle is parked too close to it, or it's a gradual weakening over time, like foliage is starting to grow over that meter box location. And that leads to another lesson, which is visiting the meters is still going to be something that's essential for all of for even with an AMI system. In this picture all the way on the left, can you see where the meter box is? It's right there in the center, but it is a little difficult to tell. And this is what can happen if we don't go to these locations and clear around the meters, and it will impact what is happening with our signals. And so we've really seen that need to go back to the meters is going to be something that we need to plan for as a business practice, even with system-wide implementation. And with that, I will turn it over to Dana Hoffenberg.
Good morning, Commissioner Keller, Chair Keller and Commissioners. My name is Dana Hoffenberg and I'm a Water Resources Specialist. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit today about the overall timeline of the project and some more lessons learned in terms of the CEP. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so as part of the AMI pilot project, we are piloting a couple different CEPs, which stands for Customer Engagement Platform. This is also known as our customer portal. So some of the things that we found is there are some registration challenges. So there's some challenges getting our customers to actually just register for the portal. We found that there's about, within the pilot, a 38% registration rate. So that really emphasizes to us that we're going to need to be really focusing on outreach when we do full implementation to get as many customers registered and getting the benefits from the portal as possible. We also want to make the registration as easy as possible to prevent any barriers from entry. Some other things we've learned from the pilot is default leak alerts. So certain customer portals require customers to go through some extra steps to get their leak alerts turned on. We've realized that can be a definite barrier, and so we want to really prioritize making leak alerts defaulted, opted in, so that customers are definitely getting that benefit of leak alerts, because we have had some customers in the portal that thought they should be getting leak alerts that weren't. We're really grateful that we had that pilot to learn that lesson. Some of the different portals also have different reporting functionalities. Some of the portals have more robust reporting functionalities than others. We found at least one portal allows us to report on resolved leaks, not just active leaks, which staff has found to be really important. So again, that's just another example of the pilot giving us some really valuable information that we're able to put into to consider for when we're going selecting a vendor for full implementation. Some of the different customer portals also have different functionalities. We found there are certain portals that allow us to, for example, contact our customers when there's an outage, when we're having to repair a water main or something like that. So again, just a lot of different things we're learning about the different things on the market that we can look for when we go to full implementation. Next slide, please. The pilot has also allowed us to get some direct feedback from our customers. So we did conduct a survey of our pilot customers. Overall, the feedback was positive. People find the customer portals helpful in learning about their water usage. We asked the pilot customers what features of the portal do they find most helpful. And a lot of times the customers said actually just looking at their week over week usage patterns is what they loved to see and what was really helpful for them learning about their water usage. Another thing that we thought was very interesting that customers appreciated is neighborhood comparisons. So letting them see how their water usage compared to other similar properties. And we thought that was really interesting, and it goes to show there is a lot of education opportunities for our customers so that they have an opportunity to understand what is normal water usage, what is typical water usage, what should they be doing. So we think that this customer portal is a very valuable tool for people to learn more about that. And then again, there's just some, in this image, you can see some written comments by some of our customers. Some people are always interested in how to save water and money. And so that's what water conservation is here to help people do. Some customers are also interested in looking at their water usage compared to rainfall and different things like that. So again, we're getting some great customer feedback from the pilot project. Next slide, please. So another great update for the project is that we did receive a grant from the Bureau of Reclamation in the amount of $1.5 million. So that was executed earlier this month. So it's very exciting for the project. Next slide, please. So this is just an overall high-level project timeline. As you can see, this project really started back in 2014 with the meter replacement project, where we replaced all of our existing meters in the field with AMI-capable meters. Then we're moving into our pilot projects, which of course are ongoing. We did receive the $1.5 million grant, and right now we are in the procurement stage. So next slide, please. So we did issue a request for proposals on the 3rd of this month, which was a big work effort. So basically our request for proposals is out and we're waiting for vendors to respond. Just yesterday, we had a pre-proposal meeting for vendors to attend and ask us any questions about our request for proposals, and it went really well and it was well attended. So we were excited about that. Vendor proposals are due on October 22nd. Again, this is a pretty complex project, so that's why the RFP is going to be out for some weeks. So we are giving them until October 22nd to provide their proposals. We're looking at December for shortlist finalist interviews for vendors, where we can interview with our top candidates. And then we're looking at early 2021 for selecting our vendor, contract negotiations, and then moving forward with the project with our selected vendor or vendors. And then finally, project completion is slated for summer 2023. Next slide. Okay, and that's it for us. Thank you. We're happy to take any questions.
Thank you for those two presentations. Are there any questions? Seems like this project is moving right along, so and it's getting to a very interesting stage. So hopefully we'll see that. Yes, Commissioner Young, you have a question?
I don't. I just wanted to say that this is just a great example of how technology can really help us manage our resources. And it's just really interesting for me to see what's going to unfold with all of this. So, I mean, really great news. Thank you for the presentation.
Commissioner Davis?
Yes, I echo Commissioner Young's comment in terms of really interesting. Being part of the beta test, I've really enjoyed it, again, for all the reasons that you've outlined there. Just one question, because you talked about how these things, you have to go uncover the meters, and there's some maintenance issues regarding that. I live on Valerio Street, which gets a lot of water and a lot of mud, and our meters get covered by mud every winter time. And I'm assuming essentially if you will, the flooding of the meter and that type of stuff doesn't affect the technology.
Chair Keller, Commissioner Davis, that kind of depends. If the devices are designed to be flooded. So if it's just water, then it's probably not going to be an issue. But if it's mud and it's thick, it could cause some weakening of the signal. And that goes to what we were talking about as far as the actual system and being able to troubleshoot some of those things in the office, come in, see, are there any areas, especially if there's more of a larger area like that, where something's happening with the signal, then we would dispatch people to go out into the field and clear off the meters and address that. So it could happen either way, where it might or it might not.
Yeah, I'm assuming that we might be one of those little trouble areas, because every winter we get a lot of mud coming down from Ealing's Park and that area down the street, and the curbside meters do get covered over almost regularly in regular wet years. Thank you for that. Thanks for the report, and thanks for the work on the project.
Thank you.
Chair Keller, Commissioners, I just two items that we are working on I think are of interest as well. One is going to be talking about potentially if we change the way that we bill, what units we bill by. So as you recall, we bill by HCF, 100 cubic feet. And unfortunately, in our day-to-day lives, we don't really have the opportunity to work in cubic feet unless you're pouring concrete, and I mean, that's in the yards. But so one of the things that I think we're going to be discussing is whether or not we want to transition to maybe billing by the 1,000 gallons that may be more relevant to our customers. So we're going to be exploring that internally, and we'll bring back that for future discussion. The other item that we're also working on is whether or not to to change out the registers. So you have the meter body, and then on top of the meter is the register. And our register at the time when we went out to bid for that, they only provided 6 dials. And so we can measure down to the cubic foot. They now have the ability to measure down to the 1/10 of a cubic foot. I believe that's correct, right? 1/10 of a cubic foot. So whether or not we want to change out our registers for a more granular detail. And so we're working on a business case for that, and also working on what the cost might be for doing something like that. And another item that we'd be bringing back in the future to discuss with you all.
Also, I wanted to mention to Commissioner Davis's point, and also what Ms. Lancey mentioned, we're looking at, we've been interviewing other cities who have gone AMI, and we're looking at the maintenance needs on an ongoing basis. So it won't be that we set these radios on these meters and then we don't visit them again. We'll be looking at annual maintenance plans and being very strategic about how we go about that. We're also analyzing what the other customer service needs are. So we're taking all that into consideration as we're going through the RFP process and analyzing what we're actually going to receive and how we're going to need to maintain that.
Yes, Councilmember Sven.
Thank you, Chair Keller. I also really enjoyed being part of the pilot program and learned a lot about our water usage. We use a lot less than we thought we did, but much more on Saturdays when we're watering, and it was very helpful. And I have a question about, I thought in the presentation, did you say that it's a separate vendor who is in charge of the interface than from the actual meters, or is that combined? Did I catch that? I wasn't sure.
Chair Keller, Councilmember Snedden, it's actually the way that we designed the request for proposals is we split it up into 4 components. So one of the components is mainly the hardware. It's the actual devices that get installed on the meters, and then the other devices that would be installed that collects that data. A second component is installation. We are still looking into whether we're going to try to tackle all of this work in-house or whether we're going to get a third-party installer to do it. Then a third component is what's known as the meter data management system. And so that's the software that takes all of the data internally and it processes it all of and lets us know things about the system status. It let us know about if there's any kind of tampers or alerts or things that we need to investigate. And there's a wide variety. So you could have a vendor that provides the hardware also provide the MDMS, the meter data management system, or you could do that separately. And so we've left the flexibility to do so. And then the fourth component is the customer engagement platform. And that's also the same case where it could be that the hardware vendor also provides the customer engagement platform, or we go with the third party. So we're excited about the way that we've structured it so that we can kind of pick and choose based on what's out there and what features that they have, that we're not tied to just a particular hardware vendor and what comes with their product out of the box. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. And excellent. And then I think by the time it comes to council, people will be interested in how long the data is stored, who it's accessible to, that type of thing the public generally will want to know. But thank you.
Okay, well, any further questions? The Commission Secretary, do you have any questions from the public?
Chair Keller, we do not have public comment at this time.
Okay, well, thank you very much. If I had my wish, we would go metric with all the reporting, but of course that's not going to happen anytime soon. Anyway, so moving on, and thank you very much, everybody, for your presentations. Very, very interesting presentation on this very innovative idea. So next, we're going to be talking about water conservation strategic plan. Mr. Hagmuck.
There we are.
Ms. Wood, thank you.
Hello. Hi, Chair Keller and members of the Water Commission. My name is Madeline Wood. I'm the Water Conservation Supervisor, and I will be introducing you to the Water Conservation Strategic Plan this morning, along with a couple other members from our team. Next slide, please. So I'll be going over the purpose of the plan, the project background, historic and current water use, and then I'll turn it over to Michelle Madaus of Madaus Water Management to talk about the methodology using the decision support system model and demand forecasting. And Jasmine Showers, our water resources specialist, will talk about the selected suite of conservation measures, the next steps, and we'll open it up for discussion and input. Next slide, please. So the plan is a supporting document to the enhanced urban water management plan that's currently underway and anticipated for adoption in 2021. The conservation plan is a long-range planning document. It'll help the city identify and project attainable conservation goals. And it's a result of a modeling effort that we conducted with our consultant, Madaus Water Management. This modeling effort started in 2010 in support of the long-term water supply plan. It was updated in 2014 in response to severe drought, and most recently updated in 2019 to support the enhanced urban water management plan. And current and new conservation measures are modeled based on the cost effectiveness of running those programs. So essentially, is it more cost effective to run a conservation measure to reduce demand, or is it more cost effective to develop a supply to meet that demand? And the plan also lays a foundation to meet future water efficiency objectives that are currently being set by the state. Next slide, please. So in terms of state water use legislation, Senate Bill 606 and Assembly Bill 1668 were set in 2018, and they are still being developed currently. They will be more fleshed out over the next couple of years, and the anticipated target setting is for 2023. So we still have a few years as this is being worked out, but essentially it will establish an indoor water use goal of 55 gallons per person per day. There will be a standard that's created for outdoor residential and dedicated irrigation meter water use, and that's going to be based on the climate and the amount of landscaped area. And then the third component is a water loss standard for leaks in the water distribution system. So these three standards that you see on the screen will be added together, and they'll represent an overall water use target for the city and for each urban water supplier. So this is not a target for each individual customer. It's for the community as a whole. It's a target that the city itself will be held to as an urban water provider. The legislation creates the targets, but it's up to the urban water provider, i.e. the city, to determine how we achieve those targets. And more information will be coming out over the next several years, and the city's been engaging in that process with the state, so we are staying abreast of those developments. Next slide, please. So before we delve into demand projections, I wanted to talk about our past water usage and talk about our current conservation program as well. So we want to take a look at where we've been before we look at where we're projected to go. And we benefit from having a lot of water use data and rainfall data and population data. So what you see here on the screen, I'm going to take you through a series of charts. And what you see here at the bottom is rainfall in inches from 1897 to 2019. This is measured at the county building in downtown Santa Barbara. The yellow bars indicate drought periods. Our average rainfall is 18 inches. And so we've just picked out a couple highlights here in terms of the highest rainfall was in 1997, and the lowest was 2006 at 6 inches. Next slide, please. So next we have our service area population added in, and that is the blue line, and this is from 1900 to 2019. You can see that as the population grew, we eventually in the 90s leveled out a little bit, and there's a bit of a slowing and a plateau in terms of the slowed growth curve. And next slide, please. And the final data set that's brought in is this green line, and this is showing water production in acre feet per year from 1897 to 2019. You can see that the water use follows the projections of, or follows the population. And then in about the 80s, it levels off a little bit, and you can see the dramatic reductions due to the drought in the late 80s, early 90s, and the drought that started in 2011. And essentially what we're seeing here with this delta between the production and the population is you can see the commitment this community has to water conservation. And currently where we're trending today is the same water use that it was in the late 1950s, but we have twice the amount of population. So we are more efficient on a per capita basis. Next slide, please. And speaking of per capita, this is a chart that should be familiar to you. This is our gallons per capita per day over the last 10 years. And the orange dotted line that you see is the state target for us. So prior to SB 606 and AB 1668, we've been operating under Senate Bill 7-7, which is generally called 20% by 2020. So our reduction goal was by the end of this year to have a gallons per person per day of 117 or less. And as we're trending, which you can see with the blue line, that is our 12-month average GPCD, we are now at 91. So we have definitely met that goal and are projecting to be well under that goal of 117 by the end of this year. Next slide, please. In terms of potable water use by customer type, most of the city's water use is residential. Single family and multifamily together add up to about 72% of total use. Commercial and industrial water use accounts for about 22%, and dedicated irrigation meters are 6%. Next slide, please. As you are aware, we currently operate a robust water conservation program that targets all of our customer classes and types. Just some key measures that are included in our conservation program are water waste prevention through our municipal code and education and enforcement, our landscape design standards for development projects, our website, which includes how-to videos, our conservation phone line that provides public education and outreach. We have free water checkup appointments to help determine the cause of high water use or improve efficiency. Our school programs, which include field trips, presentations and assemblies, rebates on clothes washers, landscaping, and mulch. The Green Gardener Certification Program, our Garden 101 classes and hands-on workshops, and irrigation budget for dedicated irrigation meters. And now I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Madaus to talk about the DSS methodology.
Thank you, Madeline. Good morning, Chair Keller and commissioners. I'm Michelle Madaus from Madaus Water Management, and I'm going to be covering how we developed the demand forecast for the community and some additional information about the conservation program. First of all, we were requested to do 4 key items. We started the analysis in 2019 and are continuing to update it with additional information. So the 4 key elements of what we analyzed were, first and foremost, future water demand. We also were asked to evaluate current conservation measures and identify new ones. We also wanted to look at the cost and water savings of those programs, and finally combine these individual actions into a program that would be increasingly aggressive in funding, but also additional water savings. Next slide, please. So the DSS model is an end-use model. It incorporates a large amount of information directly from the City of Santa Barbara service area. In addition to production, it has water information such as individual billing data from your customer categories. That would be the single family, multifamily, commercial type information. It has weather data. We did look at population growth, employment growth. I heard you were discussing that back in July and the sources for those. We are constantly updating that information. We originally did your demand forecast in 2010, as Madeline mentioned. And so every time we revise the demand forecast, we absolutely are looking at data and using the most current information available for the service area. Once we gathered all this information, we did review it in multiple series of meetings with the city and made sure that we were using the best information for the demand forecasting process. We did look at 100 different conservation measures, which is a large suite of options, and we screened it down to 21 measures. The reason we selected 21 is that we wanted to look at those ones in more depth, and also those appeared to be most feasible for this community. Next slide, please. So the DSS model was developed in 1999. It has been used in the city of Santa Barbara since 2010. The information starts large. So we look at the overall water system production, then we take it and we break it down. We look at water losses, we look at customer categories, we look at all the trends of everything that's happening. We definitely break it all the way down to the fixture level. So end use model, end means end of the pipe. So we go all the way down to toilets, washers, shower heads, all the way down. The reason we do this level of detail is so that we can capture changes over time. So as the plumbing code changes or active programs change, we are able to change out those devices and accurately reflect what is going on in your service area, and then the overall resulting per capita use and water demand with those changes incorporated. So that's the impact of the water efficiency on the end uses. Each individual year is developed independently. All of that information is incorporated and it's developed from the bottom up or the fixture level up. And then it basically adds the model all back together and then creates a top line demand. After we get the demands incorporated with those pieces of information and all the measures, then we do a benefit cost analysis. We took a very detailed look at each measure and analyze when is the program starting, what are the costs, and what would be involved. So therefore, we can make a benefit cost analysis. Would this investment in this program make sense based on the cost of water in the service area? And then in the end, we make some decisions on which ones appear to be most applicable and most feasible and most attractive for the community, and those are incorporated. And that is in Program B, which we will be seeing in just a moment. And that at the end becomes a total demand reduction from conservation, incorporating all those elements. Next slide, please. So this is a similar information I just shared, but a little bit more visual. So on the left-hand side, we have the single family, multifamily, commercial irrigation. All those individual categories are tracked independently. So the change in single family, multifamily ties back to population. The change in business and industrial tie back to your job growth. They are looked at independently and developed at a very detailed level. All of the information I just mentioned is incorporated into the model. For this purpose, we did use 2019 as our base year. We incorporated everything we had, and then we validated and verified the model with 2019 to make sure that what the model was predicting is actually what we were seeing for the city. Then we start looking forward to the future. We included population, employment, all that other information I showed you is then fed into the model. In addition, we have, and we will be talking about in the next slide, the short-term drought. That was very, very important. And we will be addressing that on the next slide. So that's why I highlighted that separately. Then we have output is the demand projections. We have not incorporated any conservation at this time. We just look at the straight demand. We do the demand forecast on an annual basis. However, when you see the population and the projections and information in your enhanced or water management plan or the conservation plan, you're just going to see it on a 5-year basis. That's just for simplicity, but do know that the DSS model is done on an annual basis. The passive conservation is added in at this time. That is all the plumbing codes, Cal Green, local ordinances, and things, and all the active conservation plans are added at this time. So both your codes and your active programs are added in. And then we come out with a forecast by category, including conservation. And we also go to the degree of doing indoor and outdoor conservation because we have that level of detail and because it is helpful to the staff to run their programs. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's take a look at what we are using as a basis for the plan. So I understand in your July 16 meeting that you saw the envelope scenarios. For the conservation plan purposes, we have utilized the baseline scenario. So on your left, you're going to have acre feet. On the bottom, you're going to have years. The dark blue line is your historical demand. This continues the discussion of what Madeline was talking about earlier. This is just a portion, obviously, of your history. It's been quite interesting in the last couple of years. I've been with you since 2010 and watched all this occur, lived through the recession and this long-term drought. It's been a very interesting time period this last decade, and also the change in starting to recover. With that being said, the demand top orange line is assuming there was no plumbing code. Because we model it so detailed, we can basically assume it's not there and then see what happened. What if all the toilets just stayed the same, everything didn't change from day to day forward, what would that look like? That is the upper line. The purple line, or the lower line, is taking into account the plumbing code. So that does incorporate the change to more water sense toilets. All the work that the conservation team is doing is incorporated into that purple line through detailed review of where you're currently at in the service area. As you notice, there's only 2 lines on here. We did not incorporate all the envelopes. This is the one that's been selected to be published. It has 2 things. One, it's realistically conservative, but it also takes into account a lot of different dynamics. Water use, as you know right now, and Madeline was mentioning, incorporates a large number of different things. You have right now not only a recovery from drought, we do have some planned growth, and we did run some scenarios on that, what the growth profiles would look like if they're multifamily or if they are going to be single family type structures. We looked at job growth. We looked at all these different elements. They're all incorporated. We looked at weather. We've looked at climate change. There's a lot of different elements, of course, that impact this. This is a simplified version, but I'm going to tell you there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and we've very carefully reviewed that, not only with the conservation team, but also WSC, who's working on your enhanced urban water management plan. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that talks about the 21 conservation measures that we analyzed. What I'm showing here is the cost per measure. So when you look at conservation programs, you kind of want to pick the ones that have a low cost, but a high savings. Those 2 incorporate together are what we get you your cost of savings per unit volume, or dollars per acre foot. I put them in acre foot because that's a common unit that the city is used to seeing. With that being said, so the measures on the very top would be your most attractive, and then the measures on the bottom would be the most expensive per unit savings of water. You can see 5th down on the list is actually the full AMI implementation and the online water use software. So this connects to the earlier presentation you saw this morning with your AMI platform and trying to convert from a pilot to a full implementation of that program. Really excited to have been involved, with that AMI grant process. Just so you know, the DSS model was working hard behind the scenes. There were some screenshots in that grant application. So we're very much engaged and connected to the city, not just for the demand forecast, but each step of the way as you're growing your program. And I was very excited to see that you were selected for that grant. I'm really excited for the AMI future for the community. Next slide, please. So this graph is a continuation of the one I showed earlier. I have added a few additional lines. So in the previous graph, I showed you the orange line, which was without the plumbing code, the purple line, which incorporates the plumbing code. Again, that's the change out of all of the devices in the service area to be more efficient due to plumbing codes from the state and federal as required by law. Then I have added a few additional lines. You can see I've had program A, then we have what we call recommended program, which was program B, and then we have program C. So we sat down with staff and WSC and kind of looked at all the different items and elements that could be pursued by the city. We took into account what you're currently doing, what's available, and incorporated what I showed before, kind of the cost information and feasibility of these measures to produce savings in your service area. So with that being said, this is your new graph. So when you look forward, when you see the publications, those lower lines are the lines that will most likely be utilized in your enhanced urban water management plan, incorporating the recommended program. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Jasmine, and she's going to explain the individual elements that are incorporated in the recommended program or Program B. Thank you very much.
And next slide, please. Hello, Chair Keller and members of the Water Commission. My name is Jasmine Showers. I'm a Water Resources Specialist, and I will be walking you through the selected conservation program. The city has elected to implement Program B, which includes 17 of the measures modeled in this planning effort. Program B here is highlighted in orange, and it includes the current conservation program, or Program A, which is highlighted in light blue. Program B is a robust program with the highest benefit to cost ratio. It provides a full range of measures and benefits for all categories of city customers. However, water use is very dynamic and responds to changes in population, economy, weather, and efficiency of devices. In the future, as the community evolves and water use patterns and weather changes, the city may adjust measure targets and schedules. Next slide, please. So this slide shows more details about Program B. More than 70% of the city's service area water use is residential. This means that residential conservation programs will produce the most savings. In conjunction with plumbing code measures, Program B saves 6% of projected demand in 2050. From the utility standpoint, the average cost of water saved from Program B is $821 per acre foot, which is less than the avoided cost of water at $865 per acre foot. Therefore, Program B has the most potential to reduce per capita water use in a cost-effective manner. Next slide, please. What you see on this screen are the demands and savings in acre feet per year over the planning horizon, which is 2020 to 2050. The top row shows baseline demands over time, and the middle row shows demands with plumbing code and Program B compliant. And finally, the bottom row shows demand savings with plumbing code and Program B. And these savings are cumulative with a reduction in potable demand of 2,615 acre feet in 2050. Next slide, please. The next step. First, we are seeking Water Commission input today. And the Water Conservation Strategic Plan is a supporting document to the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan, which is on schedule to be completed in 2021. We will prioritize measures for implementation with the highest priority given to those measures that can contribute the most to meeting water savings targets, and those measures which can be implemented with relative ease. And again, we want to emphasize that water use is very dynamic and the city may adjust measure targets and schedules as needed. Tracking of conservation measures identified in this plan will be aligned with forthcoming water use targets for state legislation SB 606 and AB 1668. Ongoing monitoring and reporting of the conservation program will be conducted, including annual reports to the City Council, 5-year updates of city's urban water management plan, and annual reporting to the Bureau of Reclamation. Also, progress on the conservation measures are tracked quarterly using the city's Paradise Performance Program, or P3. And lastly, we plan to continue to engage in the state process to establish efficiency standards as part of the new state legislation mentioned. And we do this by reviewing state documents, submitting written comments, and participating in public workshops, pilot programs, and stakeholder groups. Next slide, please. So again, staff is looking for feedback from the Water Commission on the Water Conservation Strategic Plan. And these edits and comments from Water Commission will be incorporated into the final plan, which will be a supporting document to the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. And with that, thank you for your time, and staff is available to answer any questions and receive feedback.
Thank you very much for all those presentations. It seems like this a very robust plan already. There's a lot of good work has gone into it, a lot of recommendations. Before I pass it on, I just wanted to ask, one of the areas that I've been working on is to look for combined energy water savings. And the reason for that is that a lot of times we save more on the energy side than on the water side from a dollar perspective. So it helps to get the energy rebate, which then pays for reduction of both energy and water. So I didn't see anything specific there. So if there's an opportunity to still take a look at some of those, these are areas where you use hot water. And if you can save hot water, the use of hot water, not only does it reduce the consumption of water, but of course it reduces the consumption of energy to heat it up. So that would be very useful. So that's my only comment here. I'm going to go through the order as we have them there. So Councilmember Sneddon, some comments or questions?
Yes, thank you, Chair Keller. I have this very thorough presentation, and thank you. I think there was a lot more input to this data than I realized, certainly. And can I have a question about slide 17, I believe it is? This one. So I'm just curious, we have the sort of historical demand and it dips down, and then right where you have sort of a increased slope there going up, and then at the 2026 or so, 2028, somewhere in there, it levels off, and those are such distinct points. I'm just curious what the modeling input is for that, or what the prediction is about what happens at those points.
Well, good morning, Commissioner Sneddon. I'm happy to address your question. And it's a good point. So yeah, so what we have assumed is we have assumed a drought recovery. It's done on an annual basis. And we assumed a specific time period for the recovery. If you look at the long-term graph that Madeline had shown you, we studied that pretty carefully. We've also done droughts across the country. And for some reason, there is a magic time period for about the length that it takes for recovery in a service area. So looking at your past reactions and also all of the information that we had available to us, we basically did a mountain recovery until that time period. And then when we basically turned off the drought recovery, that's where you see the change. And yes, I heard in your earlier discussion, why isn't it smoother or softer? Well, at some point, it is an estimate of when that endpoint would occur. We are absolutely going to be watching that and seeing how you're recovering. We do know that 19 and 20, you have been increasing, and we will continue to review that and judge, when that endpoint might be. But at some point in the model, you need to assume when are you starting the recovery and when are you ending it. And because your growth is not as large, then you see it kind of flattening. Right? If we didn't have it there, then it would be nice and smooth and a lot flatter, right? But I'm basically incorporating your growth and also your drought recovery in that first portion. And then we kind of turn the recovery off. And then now you're just seeing, the growth and additional dynamic in your service area. So hopefully, but I mean, at some point it'd be nice to make it smooth, but I don't really have any other information about how to shape that curve. I mean, we could make an estimate, but it's basically done on an annual basis till that point, and then we basically stop the recovery.
No, I like this because it doesn't, imply more data than you have.
Exactly.
It's a result of modeling, and it does stand out. So that's a good. I like that it's true to that. And then
yes.
Just one more question on that. How, for purposes of modeling, how is drought recovery defined? I mean, I think we've defined it differently as either now we have plenty of water, or the people's usage of water is at a certain point, or how for the purposes of this model is it defined?
So good question. So drought recovery is defined to not go all the way back up to where we were before. So we needed three things to do a recovery, right? What volume of water are we recovering to, and over what time period? And then what's incorporated into that, right? It's kind of the detail, like, okay, which category was it covering and how are they recovering? So we kind of looked at each individual category. Well, what's single family doing? Because there are individual elements, and they all took a different I would say, path, during the drought. So we looked at them individually. And then we said, okay, for this category, we can see, that it's going to recover a lot and not. So it is basically recovering to previous patterns. So the model looks at a gallons per day per account. So maybe think about it like a single family home. So historically in your service area, if you want to think about the demands as like an upper plateau, you kind of see it up above and then we drop down. So when we were up in that upper plateau, you were using a certain gallons per capita per account per day. So be per house, right? And then we go through this drought, and we're like, okay, well now each house is using a lower volume of water. So the question is it going to stay there? Or is it going to slightly recover to where we were before? Why or why not? And so there's a lot of work that goes into that, but each individual category, each account kind of looked at that, and then we make a judgment call of what do we think is, kind of a normal or base. I'm not sure if we have normal anymore, but a base realistic water use for each individual account in the service area. And then that's rolled all together, and then that becomes your recovery. So
thank you. So it's a recovery to a demand.
Yes.
More
it's
than
a volume.
Resource.
Like a volume.
It's a volume of
Like,
demand.
right,
Okay.
yeah. Right now you have like what you would consider almost like a missing volume, right? You dropped, and then the question is like, what is that volume that we should go back up to? And a lot of discussions on what that was, because we're not going fully back, right? Like some of it's permanent. Some of those fixtures that went in, they all went into your service area. They're now part of you as a community, but some of those behaviors will return. Some of those irrigation systems will be turned back on. It's that, increase, and some people's behaviors will go back to pre-drought, activities and levels of, gardening and whatnot in your service area. And so that's what it is. Let's let slow creep back up. And if you look at the historical patterns, you'll see that that always does occur. The question is how high? And we've had, kind of a lot of discussions, but it's not a full recovery. So it's that plus your growth is what makes that line go up.
We've also had a lot of discussions. I think we all wish we knew the answer to that.
For a year. So it's not just let's just apply this and we're good. It's very well thought out on and incorporate. There still are a lot of, I will be very honest, you'll have a lot of known unknowns that you're facing. So we do have climate in your future. We did look at that. You do have some growth. We had some options for growth. You do have changes in state laws. Madeline mentioned that. You do have the change in this pandemic. Is it short term? Is it long term? We will actively be watching that. And is this going to be a long term profile shift or just temporary? So we have all of that, in a blender, all incorporated into the model. And we do the best we can with information. But I will be very honest, it'll be interesting to see and watch and dynamically adjust this. We do the model and we'll be looking at it regularly. And absolutely, you publish this in the urban water management plan every 5 years. So it will.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that answer. Yeah, I'd like to call it, instead of recovery, a slide back. We would hope we'd stay down there. It's not, we don't really want to recover that demand. We want to keep it there. But anyway, Commissioner Davis, do you have a question or comment?
Actually, I have a couple comments and a question. And yes, I think we basically don't ever really get back, because I think we institutionalize our behavior to a large degree. I'll start with just really quickly. I agree with Chair Keller's comment regarding the energy-water relationship. I'm hoping in the enhanced urban water master plan, we see a vigorous discussion of that in terms of the supply and demand options. Going to the graph of the population, water production and rainfall, the nerd in me just loved it. The city planner in me just said, how come we haven't had this graph before? And I hope staff doesn't lose it over time, because I think to many of us in the community, especially that deal with the urban growth question, is how can we have growth going on at the time when we're in a drought, to basically see the relationships over time of efficiency to land uses. Again, I can't tell you, I saw that graph and I just got all excited. So thank you. That was cool.
Yeah. I'm glad you like it. It's one of my personal favorites as well. So
absolutely. Then the other part in me also basically then had this question. I always struggle with the terminology of water use efficiency versus water conservation. And as we harden these things, we're really talking about efficiency. And then the use behavior patterns relative being conservation, which again, I struggle with the definition, but that's my problem. But that leads me to my remaining question, and that is, what's the thoughts on the remaining water use elasticity during major droughts? We got up to over 30% reductions by behavior changes this time as we institutionalize more what's going on here. And we saw that after the earlier drought in 88 to 92. As we institutionalize that, yes, our demand doesn't come back as far, but we also basically don't have as much resiliency to cut back. Just any thoughts that you guys have had relative to the effects on severe drought and our elasticity for that type of conservation? Thanks.
Yeah, it's Commissioner Davis, great questions. And I love your detailed questions. They're really great. So I'm glad that you like data. We share that in common. So yes, the answer, and I'm going to answer two of your questions. So Chair Keller and Commissioner Davis, there is energy savings incorporated this for every single device. There's a whole appendix in the report. I'm not sure if you got that far, but if you want to get that far, there's a whole appendix developed to that. Every single device, if it's a clothes washing machine, a shower head, absolutely tracks that. And it's Santa Barbara costs as well. That's all incorporated in the economist benefit because it absolutely does impact everything moving forward. So that was point number one I heard. Point number two I heard was a little bit about what I would consider demand hardening. And do we have the capacity as we move forward? It is an age-old question. I have heard it for years. And, you know, I would say I was very impressed with our state when we did make the call, you know, for the droughts and our impact. I think that as long as we don't do it too often and ask people too frequently to cut back, we still do have the ability to cut back. As long as we continue to have a lot of landscape in the region, we do have the ability to continue to, you know, modify our irrigation profiles. I do water audits. I actually have personally done water audits in the city of Santa Barbara, so I know your service area quite well. So we do have more flexibility, I would say, in your community than some areas like San Francisco or Atlanta, you know, the East Coast that doesn't have very much irrigation. That would be a tougher question because they do have less of their overall portfolio be irrigation. And it's not all irrigation, but that does help. You are right, we are tightening our belt when we get to the indoor. So as we get more efficient on the washers and the showers and everything, you're right. It's like, well, there's less there and there's less to do. So yes, I would say we are getting closer on the indoor, but even then people are like saying, oh, you know, I'm taking less showers or I'm, you know, being more careful. I'm addressing more leaks. I think with AMI, that's going to be a whole new game changer. And I'm super excited for that. The level of data, the detail of data, the agencies that already had it, Dublin Santa Mountain Services District in Northern California, used AMI for their watering J restrictions and were actually able to track it. That is a whole new element when you get your system in that you did not have during that last drought. So I would say at this time, there's still a lot to be done and still a lot of options moving forward. So I think we're okay, but it is definitely a question we will continue to revisit as we move forward. And
Great, thank you.
Chair Keller, Commissioner Davis, we will be tackling that question when we bring back the enhanced urban water management plan. We'll be talking about what is that level of conservation we can expect from our community in the future going forward. And, you know, I think that's really powerful. I really appreciate Ms. Mandaus bringing this up, is that as we get into AMI, what we're hearing and seeing from that community is they continue to develop the technology in the sense that it actually can go in, they can write the programming to go in and it can distinguish indoor from outdoor water usage by certain signature behavior. You know, it's 5 a.m., prolonged use of water, it's likely irrigation. And so we really can get more into the details. And I think, and not to kick this down the road, but in 5 years when we go to do our next urban water management plan, I hope we'll be in a position to have a little more sense of just how much discretionary water is being used. I think our latest estimate was roughly 50% is used outdoors, but I think that number is going to continue to decrease as we move to more drought tolerant landscaping. And that means we have probably a smaller envelope for conservation during those extreme situations.
Thank you, Mr. Hagmark. Commissioner Young, do you have a question?
I do, Chair Keller. Thank you very much. Nice presentation, very informative. You may have answered this, but because the answer was pretty detailed, and went pretty quickly, I just want to make sure I didn't lose something. Does your modeling in this prediction take into account future droughts?
Good question. So it does not at this point. It can. It does not at this point because 3 comments. 1, we don't know when it would occur. 2, we don't know how long it would last. And 3, we don't know, like, you know, kind of what our community dynamics would look like at that point. Like we said, we're still, you know, shifting and changing. We can always simulate one, but I would need those 3 pieces of information. I have done that for other service areas, but you need to tell me when would it happen, how long would it last, you know, and then we could take a look at it. And it would basically be like it will make a drop, you know, at some point, you know, in your graph, and we could take a look at it and see what the reductions would look like. So we can, at this point, it does not, because that's just a theoretical assumption.
So Commissioner Young, we will be answering that question during our next presentation that we come back with you on the urban water management, because we will be showing a design drought and how that would impact our water supplies in this case. I think what you'd see here is kind of an envelope of best case to worst case as it relates to demands.
Right.
And then we're going to then take this information and overlay it with our supplies, and then apply to it a drought of similar, probably I would say similar, but probably to the extent of what we've seen, and maybe adding some discretion buffer to that. And then I think we'll be able to show you how our water supplies would react to that. So that'll happen in the next presentation that I think we're scheduling now for November, a more robust discussion that takes this information and then applies it, and then overlays a design drought to it.
That's correct. Yeah, this is demand only. It hasn't been married
So
with your
what you're
supplies,
saying,
and those 2 worlds come together, and then you can kind of do a simulated drought.
so what you're telling me is this demand curve is going to be altered by this additional information.
I would say it's going to be utilized to run some hypothetical droughts. The fundamental demand is not going to change, no, because this is based on assuming you don't have it, but we're running some additional analysis and review. If we had a hypothetical drought, what would that look like?
Correct.
Okay. I just want to point out that there's a previous slide that shows rainfall, and in yellow bands, you highlighted where our prior droughts have been.
Yes.
So you do have data that shows
absolutely.
the frequency and the duration.
Right. So I guess I should say your weather as you are now is absolutely incorporated. All this information you see is absolutely in there. And in my slide, I put weather. So this is all absolutely in. I just haven't simulated or put like a big drop in there due to an extraordinary drought event. That's different. So maybe we can get our lingo. So regular weather, assumed weather profiles absolutely in. We have not simulated an extraordinary drought event, but that will be coming in your enhanced urban water management plan.
That's the next step.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can see in the graph here that we had over the last 120 years, roughly, 6 droughts of different sizes. And so that's the challenge, you know, how, and the time period between them is not consistent. And so it's you know, we'll have to make many assumptions. And I think the best thing would be to have a probabilistic scenario. And I think that's what would happen. But thank you.
Correct.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Do we have any public comments, Commissioner Secretary?
Chair Keller, we do have one public comment.
Okay.
Let me open the slide. Mr. Charles Hamilton, I have unmuted you. You have 2 minutes to speak. Mr. Charles Hamilton, you are self-muted. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
I should have remembered that. Thank you. If you could go back to the slide on precipitation. I have a comment. It's a question comment kind of thing to say that I've modeled in my own analysis average rainfall since 1900 using the San Diego County data, and which corresponds closely to the city in average rainfall. In the years between 1900 and 2000, it came out somewhere in the vicinity of 20 inches as an average annual rainfall. And the more we learn about the impacts of climate change, and the more that we discover we don't know about the impacts of climate change and how quickly they're coming, I've looked at what's happened since 2002 with average annual rainfall, and it's down around between maybe 18 and 19 inches per year. That's average annual rainfall. So there's a little bit of a downward trend, and that obviously includes the big drought years. But I'm trying to get folks to start thinking more in terms of rainfall, average annual rainfall, than the word drought. Because yes, droughts do create horrible situations where we have to ration water sometimes, etc. But if indeed the climate change effects are going to continue, which I think they will, and there is a downward trend of average annual rainfall in not just the city of Santa Barbara, but in the county as a whole, that probably should be considered in the planning that's being done by the city. And perhaps you already are considering it. I don't know. I'm pretty far away from you, but that's my comment and a question. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment and question. And well, I do believe we will be taking into consideration climate change in the enhanced urban water management plan for sure. That's something that's very much in everybody's mind, and it changes both, as you mentioned, the average rainfall, but also the variability, which we saw in that graphic there, that it will vary quite a bit. Any additional comment, Ms. Meadows, or is that?
I would say yes, it will directly be addressed. It's a required section in the urban water management, enhanced urban water management plan to address climate change. So it will be taken directly and written in the plan as required by the guidebook that was released by the Department of Water Resources. It is available to the public. They have a 27-page appendix on climate change, kind of with some guidelines and some parameters. And we've already been reviewing that pretty carefully and incorporating and using similar resources that Department of Water Resources recommended to be utilized in the demand forecast. And so, yes, I would say stay tuned. It will definitely be addressed, not only in future meetings, but in the written plan as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for the presentation. It's very, very instructive. And it's a very hefty report, so you get a chance to read it all. There's a lot in there. Okay, so we're moving on to our third item, 6C, is the water rate study update. And so I think Mr. Hamilton will be presenting that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chair Keller, members of the Water Commission. I'm here today joined with Sean Korn from HDR Engineering, and we're going to be giving an update on the water rate study planning. I don't want to steal the thunder from the whole presentation, but we staff are recommending that we forego a water rate increase for fiscal year 21, and for several reasons. And then I'll give a little bit of background on where we've been up to this point with Water Commission and City Council. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Korn to look at some different scenarios and brackets that we're putting on our financial planning. So we do the next slide, please. So back in October of 2019, we contracted with HDR to do a cost of service study. And really what this cost of service study is going to do is ensure that we have reasonable and proportional rates. So rates that are proportional to the cost to serve to each customer class and tier. And ultimately that brings us into compliance and is consistent with Proposition 218. In February 2020, we came to Water Commission. At that time, we brought forward several different major policy issues. So we were talking about, if you recall, the commercial customer class and potentially changing that and looking at some analysis. We looked at the overall rate structure early demand analysis in the rate study, and several other items such as the balance between volumetric and fixed charges. At the time, we presented some preliminary estimates of our rate revenue increases. If you recall, they were in the 6 to 7% range for 3 years. So initially it was going to be FY 21, 22, and 23 doing approximately 6% revenue increases. Those were driven by, and it's still very much true, some operational costs that were trending above general inflation. So general inflation, we'll get into this more, Mr. Cornwell, is around 3% most recently, but it's been higher in the past. But we were seeing some step ups above that in our operational costs. But really largely these preliminary estimates were driven by a pretty high level of capital. So we're transitioning in this rate model to a higher level of capital investment. And because of that, we're going to need more rate revenue to support that level of capital investment. Now, that was great analysis, but it all somewhat went sideways in April and May as COVID really set in, and we were in the stay-at-home order from the governor. And so we came to Water Commission a couple times to look at the COVID-19 impacts. One thing we did talk about, of course, was wastewater at the time. What we decided, and I believe what we got support for from Water Commission, ultimately got support from Council, was we did not want to step back or forego a rate increase for wastewater. Wastewater is in a different financial position than water currently, specifically with reserves. So we continued with a 5% increase that went into effect July 1 of this year. We did decide, because the water fund has some reserves and could absorb some financial impacts, that we would defer rate changes until January 2021, and we would look at a mid-year increase. Again, today, that's changed. In the next slide, I'll go into that more. But quickly, I want to touch on how we ended FY20 in terms of rate revenues. We did see a pretty significant shortfall of about 3.7 million in rate revenues. We really had two headwinds, one of which was conservation. Conservation, as you saw in the last presentation, it's great when we're able to conserve water. We've seen it at very high levels recently. The rate model in effect at the time had conservation in the 27% range, 25 to 27% range, but really we continued to see conservation kind of trending at about 30%. So that was a headwind in fiscal year 20 kind of throughout the year. And then in the last quarter of fiscal year 20, of course, we saw a steep kind of sharp decline in commercial water demand for a couple months, which also impacted our rates. Mr. Hagmark?
Yeah, I was just going to add, and we get into this later when we get into the Water Resources Management Report. We've sold about 1,000 acre-feet of water less than we had anticipated. So just kind of give you a sense of magnitude of where we are, and currently with kind of the unknowns of COVID and our business is struggling at this point. Future is uncertain. And I can't underscore, we've been working really hard to try and put off some of these rate increases. But as we'll get into, we can't just indefinitely stop. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hagmark. Now, although we did have those revenue shortfalls, we were largely able to offset them almost entirely. So staff really took a hard look at what only performing essential spending when we went into this COVID-19 period of April, May, and June, and we had some other budgetary savings. So the revenue shortfall was largely negated by some budgetary savings. Next slide, please. So looking at our recommendation from staff and what we had in the Water Commission report is, there's several considerations in our rate planning efforts at this time. Of course, we understand the desire to be responsive, especially Council's desire to be responsive to the economic impacts of COVID-19. So we're in a very, it's a financially stressful time for the community, and to the best of our ability, if there is room to take the pedal off of rate increases, we'd like to do that. But really, I've highlighted here in that you see with that yellow background are the two main points that are going to allow us to forego a water rate increase in fiscal year 21. And so really a lot of continued work in updating our capital investment plan. And that has had the effect of smoothing out some of the projects, so moving projects from one year to another, which smooths out the cash outlay. So the cash we'll need to have available from rates. And that's been extremely helpful in making this rate deferral possible. And then secondly is choosing to debt finance certain large projects. So Mr. Korn will be going into this further, but we are going to be recommending that we take on approximately $50 million in new debt. And that is pretty significant. However, we do have a couple state revolving fund obligations that are going to be retired in the next several years. And so the net increase in our debt amount over the 10-year financial plan is roughly 5 to 10 million. And so that's how we get to a point where at the beginning of this year, we're looking at 6 to 7% rate increases for 3 years. And now we're recommending a deferral. Where's that coming from? It's coming from this work in our capital improvement plan to smooth out projects and move them to later years where possible, and increasing the amount of financing that we're going to take on. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Korn. We can go to the next slide for him.
Good morning, Chair Keller and commissioners. Appreciate the opportunity this morning. As Mr. Hamilton mentioned, I'll be walking you through some of the key elements of the updated analyses that we put together since we talked last earlier in the year in February. I'll start off with a brief overview of the rate study process, an outline of the scenarios, and then we'll walk through the key scenario results and then discuss next steps as part of the process. Next slide, please. So an overview of a comprehensive rate study is a 3-step process. And this is a slide that most of you have seen in the past when we've discussed the rate studies. It's a revenue requirement, a cost of service, and a rate design. We're really focused this morning on the revenue requirement. That's going to provide us the overall revenue needs and system revenue adjustments, percentage adjustments to revenues to meet the operating and capital needs. Once we have that tied down and move forward with that analysis, then we can go into the cost of service, which is an equitable allocation of costs between the different customer classes. So that meets our Proposition 218 requirements that you have equitable and proportional rates for each of your customer classes. And then we ultimately design rates based on the results of those two prior analyses. So an overall revenue need and the equitable and proportional allocation of costs. So as we go through this today, the focus is that first box. And that's really what's going to drive our overall discussion of what we're looking at this morning. On the next slide, I have the start of the key assumptions for the revenue requirement analysis. And as Mr. Hamilton mentioned, we are looking at a 3-year adoption proposal. So that would be fiscal year 22, 23, and 24. No adjustment in the current fiscal year, 2021, the year we're in today. And so that gives us our Proposition 218 rate schedule that would then be used more moving forward as we go through the process with the Commission and City Council. We are looking out over a 10-year period for the rate model and the financial plan, as this gives us an idea of what those impacts in the out years are. So thinking back from February, we were looking at those initial year impacts, and then what were the out years? Did we have to plan for anything as we go through this? Now, a key element of the basis for the revenue requirement is tied into what you all were discussing on the prior agenda item. And that's really coming back and looking at current revenues and customer characteristics, so number of customers and overall consumption, and what that projection of those consumption numbers are going to be going forward, because that ultimately is a big driver in the overall revenues that the water utility receives. So we started with our fiscal year 19 customer data. So that was number of customers and consumption. And then we adjusted that data based on updated consumption for what we saw coming in the spring and summer of this past year. So what were those COVID pandemic impacts? And then your prior agenda item provided us some information to use on what our consumption projections would be. So looking back at those demand forecast lines and looking at what we would expect, then we developed four different scenarios to discuss with you this morning. And each scenario has are similar but slightly different for two of them in there as we look at that. And it's really based on how we want to move forward with the revenue requirement. Because remember, this sets that maximum rate through the Proposition 218 process. So as we go through this, we want to be a bit conservative to make sure that we don't overestimate what revenues would be, and then the water utility revenues come in less than what we need to fund operating and capital needs. Another key element and change since we discussed the rate study in February is that we are including the Montecito Water District Water Supply Agreement, and you'll see it as WSA later on, revenues in the analysis. So we have those built in here at this point. And then we're also discussing the $10 million grant for desal project funding. And so we have that into the scenarios and out of two of the scenarios. So that also has an impact on our overall assumptions for available revenues to fund capital improvements as part of this. The next slide gets into more of the expense side of the scenarios. And we'll start off with the operating expenses. We have the current fiscal year 2021 budget. And as we talked about in February, and as Mr. Hamilton alluded to, there were some costs that are built into this. Part of that is the Santa Barbara Clean Energy and the allocations to the water utility, along with a couple of the other operational changes as he discussed. And we start with that, and then we project that out over time based on general inflationary escalation factors. So we take 2021 budget for 2022, then we've increased that based on an inflationary. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a few slides later on how we've developed that analysis. As we go through, a key driver of any rate study really is the capital funding plan. And as Mr. Hamilton discussed, we have some additional capital. We've smoothed that capital plan and we've pushed some projects out as part of that. And really a key element as we go through a rate study process is making sure that we have sufficient revenues to fund the renewal and replacement of the system. So we want to make sure that those revenues include a component to maintain the system, at least at its current status and levels of service. And so that's that renewal and replacement aspect of this. So a key element of that is using the water distribution infrastructure plan and outlining those capital projects, the water main replacements, and other improvements that are necessary to meet the overall system needs and to continue to provide service levels. This also gets back to the age and condition of your existing system and making sure that you're replacing that old system so that you don't incur additional costs related to breaks and additional leakage, et cetera, as we go through this, as you go through the next 3 years and looking out over the 10-year period. We have included the capital related to the deliveries to Montecito, but we also have revenue that offsets those capital projects. And a key element that we've been talking about in our internal rate group is that this is really a transition as we move forward to a higher level of capital investments. That includes AMI, ongoing main replacement, some reservoir improvements, and investments in the Cater water treatment plant. And so those are a higher level as part of that. And as Mr. Hamilton mentioned, we are looking at debt financing specific projects that's really related to Vic Trace and Cater, and projects that would be eligible for different funding sources as we move forward. Now, as we look at additional funding, outside funding, borrowing for those, we want to make sure that we're maintaining our target financial metrics. And a key one there with debt finance is our debt service coverage ratio, right? The credit check to make sure that the water utility can continue to pay its operating costs and its debt service costs as part of that. And so we've built that into the analysis to make sure that we stay above those council policy levels for the debt service coverage ratio. And then also maintaining council minimum reserve ending balances. And so as we've gone through this process, we've looked out over the 10 years specifically for those two key metrics to make sure that we meet those requirements. And as I mentioned, we've gone through and developed some different scenarios for those. So that sets the stage on the next slide for some of the background and data that is put into the development of the revenue requirement. High level, but still some of the key factors that are driving this. So on the next slide, I have a summary of each of the revenue requirement scenarios. And as I mentioned, we have 4 different scenarios. And we tried to break this down, some of the components I've discussed, but some additional components that drive the overall revenue requirements. So scenario 1 inside the red box is our first scenario. And talking about the water demands and conservation and impacts, you'll see the first 2 rows are usage rebound short-term and usage rebound long-term. For scenario 1, we're assuming no increase in demands from current levels for the next 2 fiscal years. So we're staying flat in the short term. And then the long term, we are seeing a rebound. And we've looked at this from similar to what you talked about earlier. We're looking at it from a residential component as well as a commercial component and made those adjustments to reflect how that forecast is going to play out. We are not including the $10 million DSL grant, so that's excluded from scenario 1. We are including the water supply agreement with Montecito. That annual revenue is built into this as well as all the scenarios. And we are assuming an additional $51.2 million of borrowing over this 10-year period. So it's kind of spread out almost evenly throughout the 10-year period. And those are projects related to Victrace and Capita water treatment plant. Now, as Mr. Hamilton mentioned, we do have some debt falling off the books. We have some falling off that are fully paid and mature in 2025 and in 2027. So this is essentially filling in that gap. As part of that, it does slightly increase that annual debt service, but really gets back to overall funding levels and the ability to fund those necessary capital improvements. The key element here on the debt service coverage ratio, you can see is 1.44, and this results in a 5% annual revenue adjustment in scenario 1 for fiscal year 22, 23, and 24. So it carries that forward, and this assumes a $3 million reduction in capital in this first year. So we backed out $3 million of funding to meet these overall levels. Scenario 2 on the next slide gives you an idea of what those characteristics are. So the same consumption or usage rebounds for the short and long term. So that stayed constant, but we added the element of the DSAL grant. So we've included an additional $10 million to offset our overall capital improvements related to the DSAL plant. We do have the water supply agreement revenue, same borrowing for those same specific projects, same debt service coverage, but we are able with that $10 million grant essentially to reduce that 5% a year in scenario 1 to 4.5% for each of those years in scenario 2. And we're able to not reduce capital. So we're funding the full capital improvement plan under those 4.5% per year. Scenario 3 on the next slide adds a slightly different element to this. So that first usage rebound short term, the first row under scenario 3, we have a rebound early. So this is a fairly optimistic look at what we think consumption may do over the next 2 years, where we've increased that revenue or consumption, which results in an increase in the revenues. We also have the same long-term rebound, as well as the DSL grant proceeds and the water supply agreement revenues. We're also financing or long-term borrowing for those same Capita and Victrace projects. And we do end up with a slightly higher debt service coverage ratio of 1.46. So because we have higher revenues in those initial years, our lowest debt service coverage comes up slightly. We do defer 5 million in capital, but it results in a 3.5% annual increase in revenues in fiscal years 22, 23, and 24. And then the final scenario on the next slide, we go back to no short-term rebound, the same long-term rebound, no DSL grant proceeds. We do have the water supply agreement revenues as well as the long-term debt for those same projects. Our coverage ratio comes down back to where we were before. Again, that's driven by the short-term consumption rebound. And this really looks at those percentage adjustments, the 3% a year, going back to essentially an inflationary adjustment. Now, in order to do that, you see in that last row, over this time period, the next 10 years, we'd have to defer $30.5 million of capital improvements. So a fairly substantial reduction to annual capital needs over the time period. So that sets the stage for the different scenarios that we looked at. And one of the items we wanted to discuss on the next slide is looking at our range here of 3% to 5.5%. Is what is the overall change in inflation that we've seen for water and wastewater utilities. So what's interesting is the bottom line, starting at the bottom, is the consumer price index, so the CPI. And you can see from 2010 to 2019, that's running between 1% and 2% until we get to 2016, and then that jumps up to our 3 to 4% over time. Another comparable index that we look at is the Engineering News Record Construction Cost Index, so ENR CCI. That's the blue line that kind of runs in the middle for the first few years and then drops down. Now that's really driven by construction costs, concrete, steel, pipe, et cetera, as part of that. And then finally, the top line is our water and wastewater maintenance CPI. So this is a component of one of the component indices of the overall CPI components, larger CPI components. What's interesting is you can see that in prior years, this has been running fairly high. Back in 2010 through 2014-15, we were running between 4 and 7% a year. And it's come down a little bit in the last year. But what's interesting to me as we look at this, and as we think about what we're trying to accomplish from a revenue increase and capital and operating standpoint, is that back in 2010 through 2015, any rate adjustment that we had was being significantly impacted, anywhere from 4 to 7, almost 7% by inflationary impacts to water and wastewater components. So this included pipes, operating costs, et cetera, as we go through that. So as we're looking at these other rate adjustments, even coming back to 2019, where they're all running right around 3%, that 3% component is really a component of each of those 4 scenarios. So we're looking at 5% as we go out over each year, or 4.5 or 3.5. 3% of that is really driven at a minimum by our inflationary impacts. And that's about what we've used, just slightly over 3%, given some of the changes over the 10-year projection of inflationary, or our escalation factor that we used. So this is just something to keep in the back of your mind as we look at this, because it does impact the overall costs of the water utility. And you can see that some of the specific costs that the water utility incurs, the orange line, really doesn't match up with general inflationary indices, such as the CPI or the ENR CCI component. So on the next slide, as we go through this process, here's a summary of that capital plan. So the gray background is scenario 1. The green dashed line, that is scenario 2. That's the scenario that is not deferring any capital improvements. So you see the gray difference in about 2023 between the gray and the green. That's that $3 million deferral that we've included. Under scenario 3, it ties with scenario 2 until 2027, and then we defer in the out years. That's where we're deferring our $5 million a year in capital to be able to meet those overall proposed revenue adjustments. And then finally, scenario 4, you see that red dashed line, or the bottom line, is below the gray and other lines throughout the entire period. So in order to just maintain inflation adjustments, as we talked about in the prior slide, we would have to defer $30.5 million in capital. So you can see cutting a pretty big bite out of that target capital improvement plan. One of the other key elements that we, as I've talked about on the next slide, is our debt service coverage ratio. And our target minimum is 1.25. That's the blue line or the bottom line going across the screen there. And that is the absolute minimum. And so when we think about establishing revenue levels from a rate study perspective, we want to plan on something greater than that minimum. And what you can see here is the low year is the first year, fiscal year 2022. And then we slightly increase that over time, over the 10-year period out through 2029. And so we are meeting that council policy, and we are sitting at very good levels. And I will say this includes the proposed rate adjustments. So the 5s, the 4.5s, the 3.5s, or the 3% for each scenario. And it includes the additional $51 million in long-term borrowing. So that's all built into this debt service coverage ratio calculation. The final metric on the next slide is our reserve funds. And what you see here, 0 is the target for each of the different scenarios. So the target does change based on the O&M as well as the capital plan. And so 0 represents the target for each of those scenarios. What you can see in scenario 1, the blue line, and it's the one that dips below the 0, we have 2 years where we're below council policy minimums. Again, it's fairly minimal and it's not a huge impact, and we get that back up over time. All of the other scenarios stay above that and are able to maintain that over time as we meet the overall needs of the utility to make sure we follow the council policy on minimum target reserves. So on my final slide, so next steps is really to gain any feedback and input from the Water Commission on these different scenarios. So we have 4 scenarios. The first scenario is a 5% annually for the next 3 years. The second scenario was the 4.5% for the 3 years, then 3.5 for scenario 3 for 3 years, and only inflationary in the 4th year. And a key element of that difference between those is the deferral of capital. And so that's something that we looked at as we went through the development of these scenarios. And a key goal of the rate study is really to come back and make sure there's sufficient funds to maintain the system. So that's something really to consider as we talk through this. Once we gain that feedback and input, then we would take that information and we develop that final revenue requirement analysis, and we'd be able to finalize the cost of service and rate design analyses. And then we'd come back to the ad hoc committee and the Water Commission ad hoc committee and the Water Commission to gain feedback and input from you all on that again, specifically then on confirmation of that revenue requirement, and then ultimately reviewing the cost of service results and the proposed rate designs for that 3-year rate setting period. Just a note, as part of this, the Water Commission will be hearing more on the capital investment plan in the next 2 months, in October and November. And so that information will be provided. So you'll see a little bit more of a peek under the hood on some of the details that are built into the rate study. And then ultimately, based on that overall plan and discussion with the Water Commission, we present the study results, findings, and the proposed rates for the 3-year period to the City Council for approval. And if approved, we'd move forward with that Prop 218 process to update water rates starting in fiscal year 22. And with that, I would turn it back to the chair for any questions and comments.
Thank you both. Thank you for those presentations. Very, very helpful. Could we go back to the 4 scenarios, any one of those that shows the 4 scenarios I mean, I think it shows it pretty clearly. I like the way that you've laid it out, where we can see, what's considered for each one of them. There is, I don't want to, we could have more iterations of this, but there is one more scenario that could be possible where it's an iteration of perhaps scenario 2, where you look at users rebound, no for the short term, yes for the long term, no for the desal. And then the question is, what would be the 3-year revenue adjustments considering no capital reductions? So what does that do if you have that in that case? If you decide not to take the desal, in a sense you have it there with scenario 1, but there you have capital reduction. So what would it be, just to get in a sense of what that would be? Just to sort of see that. So with that, I would like to open it up to anyone else that has any questions, commissioners or council member. Madam? Yes, Commissioner Davis.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And again, echoing Chair Keller's comments, the presentation and the graphs really laid it out very clearly. So thank you very much for the articulation of the alternatives so clearly. Since the guy who beat to death the desal grant when it went up to council, it's good to see that it's being used, Joshua. My question we had a follow-up discussion there talking about a capital maintenance reserve fund or something like that to deal with the desal grant. How's that figure into these discussions?
So the funding of the desal grant, of the reserve fund was intended to take any money not spent in a given year and roll that in there. In particular, in years we don't operate, there roughly is about $2 million in savings in the years that we do not operate. That would go to this reserve. And then in years when we do operate, it's a much smaller number. I don't remember what that number is offhand, but it has been programmed in here. I think it's a couple 100,000, and it will roll into that account and go forward as part of the maintenance. We also are budgeting money on an annual basis for desal small capital projects, and so that if unspent in that given year would also fall to that reserve.
So if I could understand it, if we don't operate desal and we have a savings of upward of $2 million, we'd put that into this reserve fund. If we got to the 5th year and we did it again, we'd have the $10 million to pay back if we needed to, if it was going to continue. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Oh, good. I really like that concept, by the way. It as you know, smoothed a lot of concerns that I had relative to that grant issue.
And I think it keeps our rates stable too, which is important, because I mean, in those years, I mean, as you know, the operating costs of desal are largely picked up by our large water users, our tier 3 users, and so you could have a lot of volatility in that cost if in the years when we turned it off. And I think now with this plan in place, you would keep that tier 3 water roughly the same pricing and put that money into this reserve account. So yeah, so it has no less of an impact on the rest of our customer base. It really isn't. The smoothing that you had mentioned.
Yeah, great. No, thank you. Again, I really like that concept, and it again it solved a lot of the, if you will, the issues I had with the grant. So then my question is, when we're talking about not proceeding with the desal grant proceeds to deal with the rates, what would we do with that money otherwise? Put it directly into capital, and doesn't that basically then come back in terms of your capital needs? I guess I just don't understand what no means in this regard on the in the alternatives.
So no is that we turned down this grant. We're going through this process now, and we're not going to take this money. If we don't take this money, what impacts does that have? And that we wanted to have at least one scenario in here where we talked about what that looked like.
Okay, I appreciate that, but since the council has voted to accept it, I'm assuming essentially we're in the yes category going forward from here. So good. Okay.
So why we included that, just for a little background, is we did get council's authority to sign this, and then when we turned around to meet with with staff from DWR, they said, "Oh no, we don't want to sign this agreement right now." And so we were like, "What?" Because we asked them to delay it, and they said, "No, if you delay it, we're not giving you the money." And then then we get approval, and then they said, "No, we don't feel comfortable signing this agreement." And so we were like,
I'm sorry I asked. Thank you for that explanation. Thank you.
Anyway. All right. Thank you. Other questions or the comments?
Chair Keller and Water Commissioners, yeah, I just wanted to add that some of what Mr. Hamilton alluded to in the capital adjustments that we've been looking at making is largely the result of the water distribution infrastructure plan work that you gave us support for. So it's been really helpful for looking at our rates and being able to come up with a solid 10, 20, or 30-year plan. So we'll be reporting back to you as a part of the annual report next month with more information about that, and hopefully giving more information regarding how these rates impact us and what we're using the funds for.
So yeah, we plan to, before we go to Water Commission to ask for which direction we should go, we plan to have at least 2 opportunities, if not more, to educate and discuss what we're planning in our capital program, what's behind the scenes driving this, so that you feel more comfortable about what are the various options and what are we giving up if we do some of these lower rate increases. So that's our intent here.
Quick, just on so you mentioned that the diesel grant right now is on hold based on the State Water Resources Control Board rather than our side now. What's the likelihood that they would not sign it at this stage? Because I mean, that makes these scenarios in which we have no diesel grant perhaps more likely, but I just want to know what's your thought?
We're still working through those issues. We're supposed to have a meeting that they canceled on us, and they were supposed to give us an answer about what they're doing and why they're delaying. And so we may have, I expect we're going to have an answer to this question before we bring this to Water Commission in February for ultimately some direction on the rates. So I think we have time. Hopefully we'll have that all
figured out. Okay. Vice Chair Kilburn, do you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, the 2 scenarios that we're looking at, assuming we accept the grant, are like the 2 in the middle that are basically, and I think maybe I brought this up at our ad hoc meeting too, but like the revenue adjustments are kind of tied directly to our capital reductions. And are we setting like a target capital reduction based on the adjustment, or is that going to be, I don't know, kind of fluctuating based on our short-term like rebound? I guess maybe what I'm thinking is there's probably some scenario between 2 and 3 that kind of balances that adjustment compared to the reductions and the short-term usage rebound. And I don't know if there's a way to specifically nail that down at this point, but once we come up with the decision whether or not we're taking that grant, I think maybe there might be some more scenarios in between these 2.
Yeah, Commissioner Kilburn, what we're hoping to do starting next month is present some of these capital, what are the trade-offs and what would we be cutting, so that you have a better sense, because ultimately in November, we'd like to get approval of the 2-year capital budget. And so that's part of a larger capital program that we have. And in there, you will be able to see, here's what we're planning to do. Largely, these capital reductions are coming from water mains. And we can talk about what the trade-offs are with that. I mean, as you may know, we had a main break in July, and the cost of just that single main break are now approaching $1 million in damages. And so we'll kind of work through some of those, because I think you're right. We've tried to provide some kind of distinct breaks here, but obviously there's a lot of gray in here, and we can look at what that maybe the commission feels more comfortably cutting certain things and not others, but we hope to provide a pretty robust discussion about what is behind the scenes and why we think certain projects need to continue to move forward.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Any other comments or questions? If not, do we have any comments from the public?
Chair Keller, there is no public comment at this time.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for that presentation. We'll be looking back at this issue in a few months. The next issue is the draft sea level rise adaptation plan. And so we'll have a presentation on this. Also quite an important topic here.
Chair Keller, we have with us Melissa Hetrick. She's the project planner for community development, and she has been working for years now on the sea level rise adaptation for the city, and I'm pleased that she's here today to share her progress on this with us. Thank you.
Welcome.
Good morning, Chair Keller and Commissioners. I'm Melissa Hetrick with the Planning Division, and I'm the project manager on the city's Sea Level Rise Adaptation Plan. And the purpose of today's hearing is to give a presentation on the draft Sea Level Rise Adaptation Plan that was released for public review in August. Next slide. So even though I'm the project manager, this has truly been a group effort. We have an entire city staff interdepartmental team working on this that includes members from most of the major departments of the city. For Public Works, that's included Joshua Hagmark and Sarah Isa and Brian Diamore. We also have a team of consultants led by Environmental Science Associates. We have a Sea Level Rise Adaptation Plan subcommittee that consists of members of Council, Harbor Commission, Parks and Rec Commission, Planning Commission, and Water Commission. And Commissioner Davis participated in that, in addition to Council Member Sneddon. And we're also working closely, especially with the Coastal Commission, who partially funded this study, but also Beacon, SBCAG, the county, and other state and federal agencies. Next slide. So just a little background, next slide. So to date, sea levels offshore Santa Barbara has not risen significantly, but it's anticipated in upcoming years that sea level rise will accelerate significantly. And Santa Barbara's shoreline has always been subject to risk. You'll see on the pictures on the right-hand side of this screen, 3 pictures from the El Nino storm events in March 1983, which caused the end of Stearns Wharf to buckle. That top picture is the Santa Barbara Yacht Club, which was damaged. And the bottom left picture is shows debris and flooding across Cabrillo Boulevard. So as sea levels rise, it's expected that these erosion and flood events will increase in both frequency and extent. And so because of that, our 2012 general plan, our 2013 climate action plan, and our coastal plan direct the preparation of a comprehensive sea level rise adaptation plan for the city. In addition, sea level rise analysis is required for coastal development permitting and is now required for most permitting and grant opportunities at the state level, including NPDES permitting, and pretty much our Tidelands grants, pretty much any permitting activity at the state level. So in 2019, we did a comprehensive update to our coastal land use plan, which serves as the development review standards for issuing coastal development permits. And as part of that plan update, we included interim policies that addressed sea level rise hazards for coastal development permitting while a long-term, more comprehensive sea level rise adaptation plan is produced. Next slide. So in 2018, we embarked on that more comprehensive effort, and the current plan covers all portions of the city except for the airport area. And the reason for that is that the airport area was studied as part of a multi-jurisdiction effort to look at sea level rise impacts and adaptation for the entire Goleta Slough in 2015. So at the end of 2018, we released a vulnerability assessment that looked at the potential for increased erosion and flooding through the year 2100. It basically shows what would happen if no action is taken. Now, we've just released in August a draft adaptation plan that looks at ways that we could address those risks. It provides a framework for future planning in phases. It analyzes a number of adaptation options that we could use over time. And those generally fall into three major categories. Options to protect development in place. Those are things like seawalls, revetments, dunes. Options to accommodate development in place. So those are things like raising buildings, modifying buildings to make them flood proof. And then options for retreat. So that's either removal of development, relocation of structures, or requiring new structures to adhere to hazard buffers. So the plan also considers economic and fiscal impacts, and it includes a set of draft guiding principles that the Sea Level Rise Subcommittee created that will assist in prioritization of actions. So these guiding principles are things like prioritization of health and safety, maintenance of basic city functions. They encourage adaptation options which have broader community benefits and which have co-benefits. And if you want to look at those closer, they're actually included in the executive summary that was an attachment to your staff report. So the adaptation plan is a first order plan. It was done for the entire city. It was not able to look at every pipe that we have. It was not able to answer every question that we have out to 2100. In addition, the adaptation plan does not commit the city at this point to any given adaptation option. So really what you can think of it at this point is a to-do list. So essentially it lists studies that we could take, and then it gives us an idea of when we may need to make decisions by. After the adaptation plan is approved, it's at that point that we would take any given recommended adaptation action and develop it further like we would any normal project, and then bring it through the normal city process for approval. Next slide. So this is our schedule. We're in toward the end of a 2-month public outreach period and comment period. We're presenting at a number of commissions and councils. We have a public question and answer webinar on September 24th. And we'll be collecting comments through on the plan through September 30th. We'll then reconvene the Sea Level Rise Subcommittee, get their comments on the plan, make revisions to the draft plan, and then the subcommittee will make a recommendation to council on the plan in the October-November timeframe. And then by the end of the year, council will consider adoption of the final plan and will begin implementation. Next slide. Next slide. So a little bit about vulnerability, and I like to go through some basic science slides because it helps really understand where we're moving forward in our approach if you understand a little bit about how sea level rise works. So there's a number of factors that affect the rate of sea level rise offshore of Santa Barbara, and they include things such as how the Antarctic ice sheet is melting, vertical land motion relative to sea levels, ocean circulation patterns, and how fast the ocean is expanding or thermal expansion of the ocean due to global warming. And the interaction of all these different factors means that sea levels are not rising the same amounts across the globe. In fact, Santa Barbara has seen a relatively low amount of sea level rise compared to, say, like the East Coast of the United States. But what this also means is that as new studies are done of, say, like how the Antarctic ice sheet is formed and how it's melting, new information comes out, and that new information changes the projections for how sea levels are going to rise. So next slide. So you'll probably hear in the news, you know, at least every week, a different story on how the projections of sea level rise are changing. And so what the state is doing is every approximately 5 years, they are compiling a technical advisory group that is reviewing all the projections for sea level rise off the shore of California. And they create this 2018 State of California Sea Level Rise Guidance, where they recommend what amounts of sea level rise that the city and counties along the coast should be planning for. So the state currently requires us to plan for the middle blue line on this graph. It's 0.8 feet of sea level rise by 2030, 2.5 feet by 2060, and 6.6 feet by 2100. So this is a fairly conservative projection. It has something like a 1 in 200 chance of being met or exceeded. There are also much more likely scenarios. So the orange line on this graph is a scenario that has something like a 17% chance of being met or exceeded. And then there are much more extreme scenarios. So the red line on this graph, it's called the H++ scenario. It's essentially what would happen if there was a catastrophic failure of the Antarctic ice sheet. So a few notes about these projections. You'll notice that in the near term, in the next 10 years, the projections are much closer together. But as we move out in time, they're much farther apart. The other thing you'll notice, if you were to look beyond 2100 at these projections, all of the projections eventually reach 6.6 feet of sea level rise. It's just that they either take longer to reach that time or shorter amount of time, depending on the assumptions behind the models. Another thing to note, these are all high emission projections, meaning that we keep the world keeps emitting greenhouse gases the same amount that we are now. If you look at the low emission projections, they show a much more gradual rise in sea levels and then a leveling off at some point. So because the projections are changing all the time, the city is taking the approach with the sea level rise adaptation plan to closely monitor sea levels and shoreline conditions, and then to take actions based upon amounts of sea level rise reached rather than exact timeframes when it might occur, if that makes sense. Next slide. So these are, you'll see these terms, near term, midterm, term, and they're really based on sea level amounts. So near term, it's to 0.8 sea level rise, which is projected to be about the next 10 years. And then mid and long term takes you from 0.8 to 6.6 feet of sea level rise. Next slide. So the vulnerability assessment took a look at the number of hazards that could be exacerbated by sea level rise. It looked at tidal inundation, which is flooding from regular high tides. So not storm scenario, just your normal high tide. It looked at bluff erosion and shoreline erosion. It looked at where waves would be breaking and flooding would occur during the 100-year coastal storm. And then it looked at areas that are low-lying and which could, even though they are not directly connected to the ocean right now, that they could flood more frequently in the future just due to rising groundwaters with sea level rise. Next slide. So these are the hazard maps and the vulnerability assessment. And just two notes about these maps. The maps show what would happen if we do nothing. In addition, the maps don't show all of our flooding hazards in the city. They only show erosion hazards that would be exacerbated by sea level rise. So this is the west side of the city, which is predominantly coastal bluffs. This is 0.8 feet of sea level rise. And the orange and yellow shows potential risk of bluff erosion. And this is really similar to the existing conditions map. We have a risk of bluff erosion now. So next slide. By 2.5 feet of sea level rise, we see bluff erosion rates increasing by about 40%, bluff erosion reaching Shoreline Drive near Ledbetter Beach. And at 2.5 feet of sea level rise, it's anticipated that 80% of the beaches that are backed by bluffs in the city will be lost. Next slide. By 6.6 feet of sea level rise, we see erosion rates 140% above historic rates. We see erosion reaching multiple points of Shoreline Drive and Cliff Drive. And at this point, it's anticipated that there would be no beach access at the beaches backed by bluffs. Next slide. So this is the east side of the city, the lower waterfront area. And this side of the city has a much better outlook with regard to beach width with sea level rise. And the reason for that is the orientated coast, the fact that the topography of this area is low-lying behind the beach. But in addition, one of the biggest factors for keeping the beaches in this area is the presence of the harbor breakwater. So the harbor breakwater essentially acts as a groin, and sand builds up along Ledbetter Beach, adjacent to it. In addition, it traps sand in the harbor and West Beach area. And then the city uses that sand, so we dredge that sand and we actually place it on East Beach. So without the seasonal beach berms that we currently place now, East Beach would, in the winter, erode much closer to Cabrillo Boulevard than it does. So this is, again, 0.8 feet of sea level rise. The aqua color is tidal inundation. The dark blue colors are waves and floodings during the 100-year storm. And the pink color is shoreline erosion. So again, this is very similar to our existing risks in these areas now. We have flooding in these areas now during storms. Next slide. So by 2.5 feet of sea level rise, we still see that the majority of potential impacts are still confined largely to the area south of Cabrillo Boulevard. However, that said, many assets, including the harbor parking lot, our beaches, and our waterfront assets will be impacted by tidal inundation and storm flooding. Next slide. So this is 6.6 feet of sea level rise. And if you look at the blue, the blue blob on the slide, you might recognize it as the shape of the historic estero that was located in this area prior to the 1920s. It was a big wetland area. As part of the 1929 earthquake, this wetland area was filled with earthquake debris, forming this lower downtown area. And it remains a low-lying area of the city. And if you look at our FEMA flood maps now, this area is already in our 100-year flood zone. And we already experienced flooding in this area. So the difference with 6.6 feet of sea level rise is that north of Highway 101, it's projected that the flood levels would be similar depths to what we experience now. It just would flood much more frequently because it would be flooding not just during high rainfall events, but also during high wave or coastal storm events, if that makes sense. South of Highway 101 at 6.6 feet of sea level rise, we see tidal inundation reaching multiple points along Highway 101, including the railroad. And then we also see storm flooding that is much more extensive, much deeper, and much more frequent than now. We also see portions of Highway 101 flooded during storms by the bird refuge. Next slide. So with regard to water and wastewater infrastructure, the desalination plant and the El Estero Water Resource Center is actually located on a piece of land that relative to its surrounding area is higher than the surrounding area. And so while there will potentially be impacts to the plants themselves by 6.6 feet of sea level rise, in the near and midterm, so through to 2.5 feet of sea level rise, the biggest issue is not the plants themselves, but the collection system feeding into the plants. So there are a number of sewer mains and other utilities that are located under the beach, which collect the sewer flows from the city and then bring them back up to El Estero Water Resource Center. And so the impact would be more to flooding of those sewer mains. And so you'll see when we get into adaptation that there's a number of actions addressing the collection system in the near term. With regard to groundwater wells, we did not do, this report did not look specifically at sea level rise impacts to groundwater. However, it did look at whether wells in the groundwater wells in the city would be in the storm flooding area. And The preliminary assessment was that by 2.5 feet of sea level rise, no production wells are located in the potential impact area, but by 6.6 feet of sea level rise, there's potential storm flooding near two groundwater wells that are north of Highway 101.
Yeah, we did, when we did the work with USGS to model the groundwater basins, we did look at this factor of sea level rise, and it does not have a significant impact on our groundwater basins. And to help kind of illustrate that, like our groundwater basins under this low-lying part of the city look like a three-layered cake. And we primarily get most of our groundwater from that lower levels, not from the high levels. And so basically those groundwater basins are already below sea level, and there's already hydrostatic pressure in those basins that is pushing fresh water out to sea. And so although significant on the surface, the 6 feet may be, it has very little impact on our groundwater basin as it currently operates. And then as for our wells, I think those would be, based on everything else, would be very easy to protect. We really just have one well that I can think of that may need to be armored or whatever, but all of them are north of the 101.
So next slide. So moving on to adaptation and how we might address these risks. So the approach in the adaptation plan is really a very phased approach. It's based on monitoring of shoreline conditions and then taking action when certain triggers or thresholds are reached. And those triggers and thresholds do build in time for planning. So we're not going to take action, say on moving those sewer mains right when they might be threatened, but we would back that up by 10 years or a certain amount of sea level rise so that we have time to be planning and prepared for things. So the sea level rise adaptation plan recommends a number of very specific near-term actions the city could take. So actions the city could take in generally the next 10 years to prepare for sea level rise. And then it proposes a structure for decision-making in the mid and long term. And after the adaptation plan is approved, it's recommended that the city develop a 5-year implementation plan, which would essentially take that list of near-term actions and further identify specific costs, potential funding, timelines, and other required resources for those actions, and then further prioritize them. So essentially getting them ready to put into our capital improvement program and other city programs. One of the first actions that's recommended is development of a shoreline monitoring program in conjunction with our regional and state partners. And that monitoring program would, the results of that would serve to update the 5-year implementation plan. And then it's also recommended that we reevaluate the longer term adaptation plan at least every 10 years or when significant new information comes out. Next slide. So moving into what are our specific recommendations from the plan in certain areas, I did just want to touch on what revetments and seawalls because they come up a lot. The top picture is a revetment, a rock revetment, and the bottom is a seawall. And essentially, these structures are placed to protect erosion, and in the case of seawalls, flooding of assets behind these structures. And they are rather successful at that for a certain amount of time. With sea level rise, they would require quite a bit of maintenance and reconstruction. Something to note about these structures, though, is they do come at a cost, both monetarily and to the environment. So they are rather expensive to maintain over time. And in addition, when you place a structure like a revetment or seawall, it often leads to erosion of the beach in front of the seawall or revetment and on either side. And so when you place these structures, depending on where you place them, it can cause very rapid beach loss. And that affects public use of the beach, public access to the beach, and along the beach. So the city in general, with our coastal land use plan, has had a strong history of not allowing these revetments and seawalls except for uses like the harbor and our major, public roads and things like that, because of the impacts they can have both visually and to the beach. But there'll be an increased pressure moving forward to use these revetments and seawalls for more than those uses. Next slide. So just quickly, I'm not going to go too much into the bluff area since I think you guys will be more interested in the low-lying area. But the plan basically took a look at beach nourishment and sand retention structures like groins, use of groins along the coastal bluff area, or other measures to slow down beach erosion in the bluff area. And it was found that beach nourishment and sand retention structures such as groins were really not be effective in this bluff area at keeping the beaches. And one of the reasons for that is the high rate of sand transport along this area and the topography of the area. So essentially, as soon as you would place sand on the beaches behind these bluffs, it would get drowned out and taken away. So it really wouldn't be worth the effort. The adaptation plan does identify rock revetments and slope protection as options, but recommends that in the near term at least, that they be limited to uses such as protecting major public roads. And then the plan recommends that in the near term, we plan to relocate non-essential assets, especially along Shoreline Park. And in the mid and long term, the city will need to consider somewhere around 1.5 feet of sea level rise, whether or not to utilize rock revetments and slope protection to protect Shoreline Drive in place, or whether to consider alternate routes for that street. Next slide. So in the low-lying and waterfront area, I did mention that the harbor breakwater plays a key role in protecting the west side of downtown, in addition to retaining beach widths in this area. And so the harbor is also one of the first affected. So a number of near-term actions address the harbor. They include raising the harbor breakwater and groins and sand spit and sidewalk around the harbor, raising the piles of the harbor marinas and piers, in addition to a number of other actions. Along the waterfront, it's also recommended that we look at additional use of beach nourishment, beach berms, and potential use of sand dunes to protect the beaches. It's also recommended that we redesign and possibly relocate an existing tide gate on Laguna Creek that prevents flooding up into the lower portion of downtown. And then it's recommended that we relocate or floodproof the sewer mains and utilities that are currently located under the beach. Next slide. Additional near-term actions that are recommended is revising the floodplain regulations for new development and substantial redevelopment south of Highway 101 to require the new buildings to build are floodproof to a higher elevation than required now. Additional near-term actions include requiring development south of Cabrillo to be designed to factor in increased erosion and flooding from sea level rise, that we initiate studies of mid and long-term options for our wastewater, stormwater, and water systems, and that the city increase the use of hazard disclosures and risk indemnifications. Next slide. So in the mid and long term along this area, there's a number of big decisions. In the harbor area, the city would need to consider whether to raise the harbor commercial area grades or whether to relocate portions of harbor facilities. The city would need to decide whether to redesign or remove Stearns Wharf. And then around 1.5 or 2 feet of sea level rise, the city will need to consider whether to employ large-scale flood protection measures to try to prevent the wide-scale tidal inundation and storm flooding that you see on the map to the right, that is 6.6 feet of sea level rise. And in order to try to address flooding at that scale, really would require the use of multiple large-scale flood measures together. So for instance, it would have to include a continuous seawall or levee along the waterfront from Ledbetter Beach to the Clark Estate. And that could either be raising Cabrillo Boulevard, essentially making it a levee, or a seawall that's located, say, south of Cabrillo Boulevard. There would have to be levees or flood walls along the lower portions of our major creeks, including Sycamore Creek, Mission Creek, and Laguna Creek, and also a small portion of Arroyo Burro Creek. Even though our groundwater production may not be affected, the actual groundwater levels that affect development, however, could be impacted, especially south of Highway 101. And so we would likely need to employ a number of groundwater dewatering wells. In addition, we'd have to, if we had a seawall, continuous seawall, and flood walls along the creeks, we would have to start pumping our stormwater over these facilities. And then an option is always relocation or floodproofing of facilities. So I would just note that with these decisions for the mid and long term, there are a number of unknowns. So a number of feasibility questions, a number of studies that need to be done, a number of legal questions. And so there are a number of studies that are recommended in the near and midterm to answer these questions. And in addition, we will benefit from the knowledge gained by other places that show these more wide-scale impacts sooner than we do, and hopefully have more information to make these decisions for the mid and long term. Next slide. So again, I mentioned some of these, but additional considerations for water and wastewater. As far as additional studies that need to be done, I mentioned that we need to do a more specific study of sea level rise impacts on groundwater levels, and that's really shallow groundwater, but also we'd want to look at further at our production groundwater. In addition, we'd have to look at how some of these adaptation options, such as groundwater dewatering, would affect our groundwater production and groundwater levels. Also, this study was not able to look at how future river flooding may change in the future due to changed rainfall patterns from climate change and how that might interact with sea level rise. There's really not a scientific consensus on that area right now, but I'm sure in the next few years there'll be more consensus on that. And then we really do need to do system-specific studies of our wastewater, stormwater, and water systems that includes analysis of potential increased rates of corrosion from increased salinities in our groundwater. And then I think I already mentioned that we need to look at mid and long-term options for the El Estero Water Resource Center and desalination facility. Next slide. So we have a web page. It's www.santabarbaraca.gov/SLR. We have all of our draft documents on there. In addition, we have interactive hazards maps on there, so you can type in your address and look at potential hazards over time. And also on our webpage, we have information on other parallel efforts that are going on. So we're currently in the process of updating our climate action plan. We just approved and are implementing a strategic energy plan. And we are currently updating our wildfire plan to incorporate increased risks from climate change. So any comments or questions can be sent to me by September 30th at slrplan@santabarbaraca.gov. And with that, I'm open for questions. In addition, Joshua Hagmark and Sarah Iza from engineering participated in the sea level rise interdepartmental team and can also answer questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hetrick. This is a very useful information, and I know there's been a lot of work that you and many other people have been doing on this. Very, very interesting. By the way, there is consensus on the science of what will happen to precipitation. It'll either go up, go down, or stay about the same. That's basically what we did a study recently where we were looking at what were the implications of climate change for the area around here. And that's what we found, that, that's the consensus, that it could go up, it could go down, it could be the same. Not very helpful. Anyway, so I think this is very interesting. And I was going to ask Mr. Hagmark, in terms of the water resources management area, do we have someone that's already tracking these issues, the studies that need to be conducted, and also to try to get an idea of what the cost of those studies are and what priorities we would have?
We're just getting into that area, and I think we're following step with this adaptation plan, which is kind of laying out the city's plan, because one of the challenges we've had along, water resources can't just go out and come up with its own plan and it being consistent with what the city is doing. So we're doing this hand in hand. For water resources, Sarah Issa is going to be kind of our key person on that. But as you probably know, every permit the city holds is tying, coming up with this plan to it. And so I feel like we're leaders in this, and we're quite a bit further ahead than most agencies, but we are trying to do this collaboratively with the city. And so we do come up with a comprehensive plan, not just one plan that works for water resources and not for everybody else. I do want to add to this, one of the other ones we'll be talking about is the Braemar lift station. So that's by Henry's Beach. That's another major piece of infrastructure that moves, and I don't know, 20% of our wastewater flows or something. And so wanting to ensure protection of that. And so that will be in there. And, but I think in the short term, one of the things we're going to be talking more and more about is the collection system. How do you protect the collection system? And as I think we've talked about a little bit, it gets tricky because there are some really easy solutions to protecting the collection system, but our system works by gravity. And so if we harden our system, that means when there is a backup in the sewer system, it will show up in people's businesses on Cabrillo and homes and everything in there. So the challenge is, and that's why we have to do this collaboratively as we go through this, because certainly we aren't the only community. I mean, Galveston stands out as a community that regularly sees insane tidal surges, and they have a sewer system and it handles that, and they've built their houses on stilts. And I'm not saying we're building ours on stilts, but there are design solutions that we can address, but it does need to be comprehensive. I don't think something that works for wastewater specifically may not work for the community as a large. So I think that's why we need to work together as we develop this.
Yes, I would just add to that, Chair Keller, that with the wastewater system in particular, I mean, we could decide all we want to about what we want to see happen with that, but really it's a factor of the development that it serves. So if development, how development changes happen and where development is located in the future and the hazards that is prone to, it's going to very much factor into our options for El Estero and the wastewater treatment system, because we're serving those developments, right? So it is good to look at these things comprehensively. And the idea is that starting in 2021, we would go through that process of basically like prioritizing projects, putting a lot more detail to the proposals, costs, all the things you were mentioning, and that we basically get started on them.
Okay, thank you.
And to put a value to it too, because this sometimes comes up, the value of El Estero, it's about a $500 million facility. It's about a $500 million facility, providing probably the single most important protection of the environment. And so as we work with that, if it comes to relocating it, where do you put something of that significance? Fortunately, our forefathers did elevate it in its location, as Melissa mentioned. It is sitting on, I believe, about 3,000 micropiles that keep that facility from sinking into the material that's down there, and it is elevated. So at least we have a significant amount of time to at least start that preparation for something of that magnitude if we do need to move it.
Right. Most of that infrastructure is above ground and it's elevated. So yeah, I think that's why it's a question of sort of studying it in detail to try to see what we would need to be done to protect as much as possible the system. Yeah. Commissioner Young.
Thank you, Chair Keller. Melissa, great presentation. Learned a tremendous amount. Couple questions for you. If we could take a look at figures ES6 and ES7, when you use the term erosion, like long-term shoreline erosion or bluff erosion, and then you colorize it, is that indicating an active area where erosion will be taking place, or is that where erosion has already happened and we have reset the bluff or the shoreline?
So, Commissioner Young, you are referring to in the slides, slides 12, 13, and 14, just for Raquel. So my understanding is that, so for instance, yeah, this is a good slide. So 0.8 feet of sea level rise, that orange level and yellow level are the threat of erosion over 75 years. So the reason we do it that way is when we're permitting new development, we look at trying to place new development outside of the area that could be affected during its lifespan, and the assumed lifespan of structures is 75 years. And so as far our development regulations and our coastal land use plan require buffers that try to avoid this area, and it's a hazard screening area for our development review permitting. So what this shows is the potential for bluff failure and erosion over a 75-year period with 0.8 feet of sea level rise. It's complex, I understand. This does not show that's why it's called long-term bluff erosion. This does not show the actual bluff top. If you look at our vulnerability assessment, and actually if you look, this is based on data from USGS model called Cosmos 3.0, and it's at ourcoastourfuture.org, I believe. You can actually see the bluff position. If that's a factor, you want to see where the top of bluff is and how it's actually moving. This is more like a screening hazards area for development planning.
Right. So it is like a zone. It's a zone of erosion.
It's a zone of potential.
This is a zone where erosion is anticipated. Yeah. Okay. Right. Potential. Okay. And then the other question I have is, under the scenario that we're following, by 2060. Sea level is estimated to rise by 2.5 feet. And so I'm wondering, in our normal tidal cycle that we have right now, is there a point that we could go outside and see what that actually looks like? In other words, if we go to a 2.5 tide, plus tide, is that the same as 2.5 feet of sea level rise by 2060?
So the 2.5 feet of, I'll start out by saying I am not a climate scientist. I'm a planner, so this is my layman understanding of these concepts. So I just like to give that caveat just in case. But my understanding is that the 2.5 feet of sea level rise, that is mean sea levels. So within that mean, you of course every day see a high tide and a low tide, and then in the year there's extreme high tides and extreme low tides. So when you look at these maps, it's taking that 2.5 feet of sea level rise, adding onto it the extremes, the extreme high tides, and then adding onto that how sea levels and waves can raise that even more during storms. So so if you wanted to see what a mean high tide might look like in the future at 2.5 feet, yes, you could go to a high, like a king tide situation, and see where that is flooding. And in fact, we have done that. We have in fact, Commissioner Davis, I have pictures right from him and in this report during our last king tides, because that gives us an indication of areas that will be inundated frequently in the future during a lot of tidal conditions. Another good factor to look at is conditions that happen during El Nino events, because during El Nino, sea levels actually also rise more than La Ninas. And so the events of, say, like 1983 and those other El Nino years gives an indication of what will happen during higher sea level rise event. And actually, one of the edits we are making.
So Melissa, that's
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's my confusion. Is that a king tide is about 7 feet, and so I'm just trying to picture how does that relate to 2.5 feet of mean sea level rise by 2060? I don't know, Chair Keller, do you have a way to
Ms. Hetrick,
kind of visualize that?
No, I think Ms. Hetrick was doing a really good job of saying the 2.5 is the mean, and so that will rise, and then you have these events which are going to go up and down, and so your king tide is going to be on top of that. You'll have, you know, a 5 to 7 feet rise, which, you know, that would be a severe flooding of all of that low-lying areas. Yeah.
Chair Keller?
Yes, Commissioner Davis.
If you look at what mean high tide with 3.8 to 4, and you put the 2.5, you're essentially at 6.5 feet. So that the picture on the cover there is at about 6.6. So that would be basically now the new mean high tide at 2.5.
High tide, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
High tide, right. Yeah. And that's the mean high tide, not the extreme high tides that you may have. Yes.
That's correct.
Right.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that presentation. Do we have any comments or questions from the public?
Chair Keller, we do not have public comment at this time.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Hetrick. This was very, very informative. Okay, on to our last item, administrative item, the water agency's update, and we'll need to move this along since we're running out of time. So please go ahead.
Good afternoon, or good morning, I should say, Chair Keller, Commissioners, and Councilmember Snedden. I'm Kathy Taylor. I am the Water Supply and Services Manager, and I will try to thank you. I got a phone call. I will brief. I want to start off with a Kachuma Safe Yield study that was recently performed by the Santa Barbara County Water Agency. The safe yield of the lake used to be originally at 1948 when the project was constructed. It was 33,000 acre feet, and it has diminished over time. Currently, and since 1995 it was established, and up till today it's 25,714 acre feet. The county recently contracted with Stetson Engineers to create a new safe yield for the lake. We're not sure how long this study has been going on, but we received a presentation, the Kachuma member units of the safe yield study, which proposes reducing the safe yield by approximately anywhere between 18 and 31%, depending on which modeling scenario is used. So that would significantly reduce the safe yield from the current 25,000 to anywhere between 17,600 to just over 21,000 acre feet. So it'd be a significant decrease for us. The Kachuma member units, we are a member of one of which are who are us. We're not consulted regarding the study, so we did not provide any input. Despite us monthly asking for updates, the county would not share what they were doing, and also despite the fact that the county is bound by contract to represent us on these issues, on Kachuma issues. So we were really concerned about the study and the process. The Kachuma member units, if anything out of this whole process, we have banded together and are quite united on this front. We sent the county a formal letter expressing our dissatisfaction with the study and how the entire process was carried out. Additionally, the Kachuma member units have banded together, and we're going to be working with a contractor, Woodward Curran, It's a modeling, they're a modeling consultant to develop a safe yield study that focuses on optimizing the water use in the reservoir for drinking water purposes. And so we'll be working on that over the next many months, and I look forward to giving you an update on that. Moving on to the USBR, they are proposing changes to our carryover water. Just to remind you, carryover water is annually, each Kachuma member unit is given an annual allocation in the lake, depending on how much water is in the lake. And the city's portion is 32% of the annual allocation. And any water that is not used, it's banked year after year until Bradbury Dam spills. And then once it spills, all the carryover banks pretty much go to zero. And this is how the lake has been operated for 70 years. And in June, when we had a conversation with the area manager from the USBR, he casually mentioned at the end of the meeting that he wanted to address carryover and potentially cap it. And by the end of July, we received a letter with a proposed plan to cap the carryover water at 25%, which would significantly impact our water planning strategies and how we manage our flows from the lake. And then we received, and we also received notice that this carryover, the changes to the carryover they were suggesting it would be effective October 1st of this year, so at the beginning of the water year, which it's very last minute for us, and a very late hit, and for our water planning. And after many internal and external discussions, Dan Henschke was successful with talking to the USBR to get the carryover issue moved to the master contract negotiations, which are anticipated to happen within the next 3 years in advance of the master contract renewal, which is anticipated for October 1st of 2023. So that is a big issue for us, and the carryover is really important to us. And if they were to cap it, it would just change how we manage water in the lake. We would, go to more of a use it or lose it mode of management rather than banking our water. And it would diminish our other water supplies as well. We would really not have a need for use recycled water, because we'd be using water out in the lake because, again, use it or lose it. And it's inconsistent, as I mentioned earlier, with how the lake has been operating for the past 70 years, and we've built our water supply planning around the idea of having carryover water, and it's very important to us. So moving forward, we are again going to band with the Kachuma member units to create an argument for the benefit of having water stored in the lake, and we will be, I'm sure, modeling the impacts of capping the carryover for water supply planning. And we will use, we'll band together for the negotiations that are going to be upcoming with the USBR for the next contract. As I said, it expires in 3 years. So, and on to CCRB. With this carryover issue, it's caused the consultation process for compliance with the state water board order to be, just to be halted, because any changes in carryover just kind of throws, a wrench into all of the good science that have already been done on the river. And so the board has decided to stop all work related to assisting the USBR until they do sign a contract. And we know, stating what, the contract for extension, to make sure that there are no changes to the carryover that for the next 3 years until we negotiate the new contract. In COME, they just released a sediment study for Lake Kachuma for the Kachuma member units to all provide comment. And they also have submitted or distributed the design for the secured pipeline that would be in the lake that would extend from the site one of the barge to the intake tower. And with that, I'll take any questions about any of what I just presented to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the very quick presentation. Any questions? These are very important topics, but I'm glad we were able to push the negotiation for the longer discussion. Any questions from the commissioners or anybody else? Okay, any questions from the public or comments?
Mr. Keller, there's no public comment at this time.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Taylor. Mr. Hagmark, your Water Resources Manager report.
Yeah, so I just wanted, before I dive in here, just a few comments. I just wanted to let you and the commission know that we did execute a second year of contract with Marburg to continue to dispose of fog material at El Estero. And as of for COVID, no significant changes. We continue to perform weekly wastewater testing for COVID. However, correlating that data to cases in the community is still a science that's being developed. So we're collecting that data though, participating. We did find another lab outside of BioBot that's able to do that for a much more reasonable cost. And with that, I just want to dive then into our planned and actual. And I think the bottom line here that I wanted to show was that the city, and this is why it was so important, is carrying a significant balance of water in Cachuma. And that's the result of us operating desal. I mean, here, this is the direct benefit is we have this significant amount of water that if we did enter a drought cycle, we'd have a good buffer to manage through that drought. We also have been using a lot more Gibraltar water than we had anticipated, which has been great. And we have also been receiving a lot more desalinated water than we had thought. We didn't anticipate the plant going down for some work on the intake pipeline, and that work has been delayed. So we do need to do that work in the future, but that's currently being scheduled, and so production from desal looks much higher. But overall, what I want to point to down here is where we are. We're about 1,000. We've sold about 1,000 acre feet of water less than what we had anticipated, and that is the kind of leading to what Mr. Malcolm or Mr. Hamilton has mentioned, the financial impacts from that. And we're continuing to see that. It does seem there was some rebounding this summer. So we did, at least from water usage that we saw, but it's still a big uncertainty with our local businesses being shuttered for the most part. Next slide. Here again, just in graphical format, just showing where we are as planned for the year versus actual to date. And then the bottom is actual to date planned versus actual to date used. And you can see that at least in the to date, that's basically we're using much more Gibraltar water than we had anticipated in our planning. Next slide. No significant changes here. Next slide. We saw this during our water conservation strategic plan. So next slide. They are predicting right now above average temperatures going forward for the next 3 months, which isn't good for fire season. Next slide. And Chair Keller was saying we got equal chances of rainfall predicted for the next 3 months, which doesn't give us much of an indication. Next slide. Nothing new on this slide, just continuing to follow where the lake levels are. Next slide. Just presenting here, we're in August, and looking at that bright purple, that's the 2020 recycled water. And we had strong production. It's probably our peak month between July and August, and no use of blend water. And with that, we did send an agreement back to La Cumbra Mutual Water Company, and We'll continue and anticipate before the end of the year, we'll be bringing something to Water Commission for consideration and recommendation onto council for an agreement to sell them 40 acre feet a year of recycled water. Next slide. Wastewater flows, and this kind of speaks to the shuttered business community. Wastewater flows are at historic low levels. 5.8 MGD was the average for August. And as you can see from past Augusts, when we've had normal tourism and activity, almost 750,000 more in wastewater flows coming in. So pretty substantial. Next slide. Next slide. So this data here is just an update on the SLIP program. We will be coming back to you in the next couple of months and continuing to provide you updates. In September, though, we had been just sending notices to people that had an emergency situation or had a private spill. We are now sending letters again to all of our customers who have issues or defects on their potential defects on their laterals. Again, these letters are friendly and there are no penalties for not responding, but we do think it's important to inform our customers that they have an issue, and hopefully they can take this additional time to plan to make some repairs and keep their lateral in good health. Next slide. I want to celebrate right here. We are at September 10th, and I should say, as of today, September 17th, and we've had no spills this calendar year. Really remarkable. Yeah, exactly. And as you can see, our community, and these are again the only ones we know about that contacted us, but 17 private spills, and I would guess there's probably 3 times that actually are occurring and that do not contact the city for assistance. But you know, that just illustrates the importance of the SLIP program. Next slide. And this last one here, I think is, again, it's just kind of more information talking about how people are using those who are making repairs to their laterals, what programs are they using. At this point, they're still using private contractors to do it. We've gotten a few people taking us up on the offer to have the city's contractor take care of their lateral. And then what you're seeing here too is this option 3, which is in areas where we're planning to do work on the city's main, we are offering the opportunity for that contractor to do work, and folks seem to be interested in taking us up on that. So there seems to be an uptick. And I think it's just, again, us trying to be supportive of our community and help try and take care of these failing private sewer laterals. And with that ends my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that the commission or public may have.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that presentation, and congratulations to everybody on the SSOs. I mean, that's a really great result. Any questions from the commissioners or council members, Nevin? Any questions from the public?
Mr. Keller, there is no public comment at this time.
Okay. Well, given no more questions, I think that concludes today's meeting, and we will be meeting again on Thursday, October the 15th. So thank you, and please stay safe. And thanks for all your hard work. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.